Hi, so the person who handles this request is not available at the moment. Would you mind calling back later on today?
They are the lords of Hollywood for the most part, and they yield a lot of power. And God forbid you should buck that power, you will immediately be labeled as being anti-Semitic and not part of the crowd, the in crowd. And that's just the way it is.
Yeah, the person who we're trying to reach, they're currently at lunchtime right now. Can you go ahead and call back a little after 2:30?
Movies are just entertainment. Don't take it too seriously. That is one of Hollywood's big lies.
Yeah, they're still not back from lunch.
Nepotism is hiring someone because they're family. Cronyism is hiring someone because they're friends. Favoritism is hiring someone because based on some arbitrary factor that you favor.
Well, it's just simply that we cannot accept unsolicited material.
What would be the reaction of many people in Hollywood today if all of a sudden we said, 60% of the upper management in Hollywood and the top level executives are Christians? What would be the reaction to that?
Take down messages, but if you could call back on Monday, she should be in then.
The mainstream media, a powerful machine that's somehow terraforming the political, economic, and cultural landscape of America. And we see this every day in the movies and nightly news, a continuous assault on traditional values and important principles set forth in the U.S. Constitution. Unfortunately, few of us understand what's happening because those who are paid to inform us are actually paid to keep their mouths shut. For were the anchors or celebrities who work for the networks and studios to make the mainstream media the issue, or were they to say the wrong thing, they would be fired or blacklisted. Given these realities, the documentary you're about to see will probably not be coming to a theater near you. And the reason for this is because we will be pulling back the curtain to see why the mainstream media is indeed the issue. We will now see how Hollywood movies and the New York media create what could be called a restraint of trade in the marketplace of ideas.
The marketplace of ideas concept is really one of the underlying principles of our democracy. And the idea is that if we do not restrict the flow of information and ideas that are available for a particular discussion, a public discourse, some issue that is of importance to the country, we're more likely to come up with the best idea or the truth.
Well, restraint of trade actually takes you back to what is the standard of trade. And generally in the history of this country, it's been the concept of the free market, open competition. So, therefore, restraint of trade is anything that infringes upon open competition and limits the freedom of the market.
This applies to the film industry in the sense that to the extent that we narrow the availability of ideas, then the film industry in effect is diminishing the strength of our democracy.
And we will see why the mainstream media promotes the globalist agenda, an agenda that sanctifies free trade, has destroyed the U.S. manufacturing base, bled the American middle class of jobs, corrupted the family unit, tolerated fiat currency, and encourages infringement of the Second Amendment so completely We the people are increasingly subject to the very terror the mainstream media helps generate every evening on the nightly news.
The agenda is to build what they like to call a new world order. The new world order is world government based on the model of collectivism. In its essence, collectivism is a political and social system. It's the kind of system that Adolf Hitler had in mind, that Lenin had in mind, Stalin and Mao Zedong. So the globalist agenda, in my view, is not a good thing. It's an agenda for world enslavement.
But before we get into these issues, let's take a quick look at the history of the Hollywood movies. What would grow into radio, television, and cable networks to collectively become the mainstream media. A term that refers to any program that's produced and or distributed by the major studios or networks and seen by a wide audience.
Hi, so I just found out that the person who handles this call is on vacation and won't be back until next week.
The movie industry has a history as rich and intriguing as any of the movies it's ever produced. What's more, America may not have become the great nation it is today without the vision of the Jewish immigrants who established the movie industry. These were the original movie moguls, many of whom started out in Manhattan's Lower East Side and later moved west. Unlike the world they grew up in, the moguls entered an America of robust, nuclear families headed by strong fathers, doting neo-Victorian mothers, and happy children. Most Americans were from one-income Christian families that constituted a strong and growing middle class.
The American dream was liberty, the freedom to worship God, to raise our families. That was the American dream. And I think over the years, the focus has changed, and I think that the emphasis now on materialism was not the original dream of the Founding Fathers. And quite frankly, I think it's very important that we get back to the original dream of the founders, which was liberty.
Even though the business establishment at turn-of-the-century America was somewhat discriminating, if not anti-Semitic, the movie moguls took the high road. They created their own businesses, including the first Nickelodeons, theaters, and motion picture production companies. The movies they would go on to produce ignored the bad and built on what was good about America. Not only did the moguls want to assimilate, they made movies that got us through the Great Depression and the World Wars, movies that uplifted us with dance and musicals, hope and visions of prosperity, Art Deco, romance, dreams of a better life and a glorious future. For the immigrant moguls knew what it was like to go without, and so they worked ever harder to inspire an America to go in style, to have good dads, loving mothers, responsible children, a respect for religion, productivity, innovation, low debt, and a higher standard of living for each generation.
The original movies were very, very promotional of a new dream, a new country, a new way of life. They were respectful of traditional values, and they in many ways not only promoted the American dream, but established what many people adopted as the American dream.
Their wholesome and imaginative black and white movies, TV shows, and nightly news inspired America to become greater than anyone ever dreamed. Unfortunately, not everyone found the moguls' vision uplifting. Thomas Edison, inventor of the motion picture camera, used ruthless collection tactics for royalties on his patents. So much so, he eventually forced the moguls to leave town. And they did, to a sunny suburb of Los Angeles that became known as Hollywood.
So you'd have to say they were probably wrong in doing that. But Edison, on the other hand, hired thugs to run after these independent producers, sometimes referred to as the outlaw producers, and beat them up or assault them. And so this is one of the reasons that is sometimes cited as a reason for the founding of Hollywood.
They also needed the sunlight because the exposure index of films of the day was very, very low, somewhere around an ASA of something like 5 or 8, as opposed to today's films, which are at 250 and 500 ASA. So being close to the Mexican border to get away from Edison's patent thugs and having plenty of sunlight and reliable weather out in Hollywood land were the reasons that the movie moguls left New York City and basically set up 5 movie studios and 4 mini majors in the area of Los Angeles.
There, far from Edison's patent police, but near the Mexican border, the moguls built an even more glamorous industry than what they had left back east. For what kid hasn't marveled at Hollywood movies, the silver screen with its mind-boggling action adventures and the endearing romances of our favorite stars? And now, a global industry. What nation has not benefited from Hollywood movies? What people have not been able to feel closer to other people, especially when we realize that we are more alike than different?
People feel closer to people who they may have never met by virtue of seeing a story about someone they don't know, but has aspects of their life that matches the life they live. The technology of film and television is just another way of people telling stories to each other.
Yes, the movie moguls would go on to present an idealized vision of the American dream and even build an empire of their own.
In his book, An Empire of Their Own, Neil Gabler explains how these mostly Jewish immigrants came here. A lot of them had dysfunctional families, bad dads, and they made movies that reflected a more idealized scene, a scene that they would have liked to have seen.
And now, 100 years later, this empire creates thousands of hours of movies and TV shows every year. The production output from hundreds of companies, a cornucopia of human thought now on everyone's fingertips. Unfortunately, this cornucopia is but an illusion. 50 shades of gray, but little or no color.
It seems that we have a cornucopia of media with different views. But in reality, in spite of the fact that we've got different networks and different channels and maybe 100 different options on our television sets, if you look at the viewpoints of the mainstream of those channels anyway, they're all pretty much the same. So it's an illusion that we have a lot of choices. It's the same kind of an illusion when you look at political parties, for example. It's the feeling that, well, we've got the Republicans or the Democrats here in the United States, and that certainly is a choice, isn't it? And there are choices, of course, on viewpoints on a lot of minor issues, but on the really big issues like American sovereignty, the Federal Reserve System, which is a banking cartel, those issues are not a point of debate or a different point of view at all of these different news channels that we talk about, and we think, oh, we've got all of our choices. Yeah, they'll talk about a lot of little things, but the really important issues are not even up for discussion.
We have been trying for 10 years to address every outlet of the mainstream media has received our DVD, our petition calling for a new investigation with 2,500 architects and engineers, but we don't get any reporting from that.
As we will more fully explore, certain issues, subjects, stories, and whole populations are now ignored, invalidated, vilified, and defamed every time we turn on a TV or watch a movie. In fact, from our teens to our 40s, the Hollywood movies now indoctrinate us with all manner of violence and propaganda. And then, from our 40s onward, the New York media riddles us with a narrow spectrum of anti-constitutional liberal news from almost every outlet. Let's take a look at the structure of the mainstream media and shed some light on why this happened, how it restricts our speech, and how it promotes a globalist agenda that's destroyed the American dream.
Yes, unfortunately he's filming, so we wouldn't be able to do it within the next month.
Today's mainstream media is comprised of hundreds, if not thousands, of media companies. These media companies are engaged in the production of motion pictures, news broadcasts, TV programs, documentaries, and advertisements. As mentioned, one would think this cornucopia of media companies would be delivering a cornucopia of diverse news, entertainment, information, and ideas. After all, these media companies are peppered across the nation from coast to coast. Unfortunately, as widespread as they are, almost all of them are owned by basically 6 multinational corporations, what's known as conglomerates.
A conglomerate involves a situation in which one corporation will own a number of other corporations in different areas of economic activity, but they would all be controlled by the head of the conglomerate.
These conglomerates are Comcast, Disney, Sony, Time Warner, 21st Century Fox, and Viacom. So, rather than having hundreds of independent media companies across the nation, we essentially have just 6. Collectively, the 6 conglomerates thus control almost all of the programming in the United States.
Over the last 50 years, there's been a tremendous consolidation of the mass media. It's gone from over 100 companies to 6 major companies. In the process, these companies have started to overlook major items of news, especially when it respects or has an application to their financial well-being.
Shows like the History Channel, Good Morning America, Colbert Report, Face the Nation, The O'Reilly Factor, Morning Joe, Meet the Press, Fareed Zakaria, Rachel Maddow, and Barbara Walters Special are all financed, produced, and/or distributed by the conglomerates. But the crowning jewel for each of the 6 conglomerates is their ownership of one of the 6 major movie studios.
The term major Hollywood movie studio is a very large corporation usually, which makes a lot of motion pictures and employs a great number of people in all disciplines of the movie making process.
These studios are known as the MPAA Studios, and they are Universal Studios, the Walt Disney Company, Sony Pictures, Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, and Paramount Pictures.
There are independent studios. There are very productive studios in North Carolina, for instance. There are studios all over the country, in Arizona and whatnot, where movies are shot. But the MPAA, the big studios, are members of the Motion Picture Association, and they are primarily in Hollywood.
These 6 Hollywood-based movie studios produce and/or distribute movies watched by about 95% of the viewing public. And most of this audience is comprised of young people.
If you add up that market share, it'll come close to 90% in any given year. And then I suppose the major studio distributors weren't satisfied with just approaching 90%. So almost all of them either bought or created wholly owned subsidiaries that engage in competing with the independents for the lower budget films, things below 20 million. And if you add them all up together, you're getting up to 95% or so each year for the market share of the major studios and their wholly owned subsidiaries.
At the same time, older Americans are treated to the homogenized output of just 6 New York-based news networks. We all know them as CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. This is where we, the voters, get 95% of our news. Given this state of affairs, the savvy citizen may ask, how has such a small group of corporations been able to dominate the entire mainstream media?
And the answer is the few have control over large quantities of money. They have control over credit. They have control over banking, money issue, as a matter of fact. And we're talking now about the banking fraternity. And if you look on the boards of directors of the great media corporations, you see an interlock with banking institutions. So money is the answer to the question. And a long time ago, they decided that to control the thinking of the population, it was necessary to take over and control the media.
Let's consult some more history. Previously, we saw that Hollywood was founded by a small group of European immigrants who wanted a better life for all. These movie moguls numbered only about 20, but they founded 5 major studios and 4 mini-major studios between 1912 and 1935.
The original major studios that were formed in Hollywood were Paramount Pictures, RKO, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Warner Brothers, and 20th Century Fox. Believe it or not, Universal Studios used to be considered a mini-major. So the mini-majors were Universal Studios, United Artists, and Columbia Pictures. There were also some minor studios, and those minor studios were Disney, Monogram, and Republic.
With the formation of these studios, Hollywood grew and prospered beyond imagination. Back east, Edison produced a series of short, mediocre films. The Great Train Robbery in 1903 was possibly the only exception. As competition on both coasts continued, Edison sent his patent police west in an attempt to shut down the Hollywood moguls for movie camera theft. However, by 1915, when Edison's production company went bankrupt, audiences were loving Hollywood movies so much, nothing ever came of the patent lawsuits.
The independent producers eventually sued the Edison Trust, or Edison, and prevailed in the courts, and so therefore got their freedom to go and continue to use their movie-making equipment without having to pay license fees to him, because he went overboard in engaging thugs to collect his money.
And as the studios prospered, actors, writers, filmmakers, and people from every vocation flocked into Hollywood to get a job in the talkies. And they did. It was the studio system, a vast industrial complex of vertically integrated motion picture production, distribution, and exhibition entities.
The studio system was basically a factory for motion pictures. It was put together by the original movie moguls, and they built a dream factory whereby they created an assembly line type process of making motion pictures. Hundreds of them a year, each studio, and the appetite across the country was insatiable.
As glamorous as the film business may seem to many people, the studio system is a business, and these studios are run with precision, and they're power-based, not unlike Wall Street or any other they are corporations. So the studio system, for instance, when I was placed under contract at 20th Century Fox, I was a member of a family, a proud member, and they did go to extreme lengths to keep us happy.
The studio system ensured that all the actors, writers, directors, producers were pretty much employed from picture to picture, so they were able to focus on their art rather than on money in the ad hoc system like we have today.
By the mid-1930s, the studio system had spawned over 17,000 movie theaters across the nation, and 60 million of the nation's 130 million people went to the movies every week. It was the golden age of Hollywood. Yes, even millionaires like Joseph Kennedy and Howard Hughes caught the movie bug. Everyone wanted to produce movies and tell their unique stories. And many great stories were told. The 1930s alone produced All Quiet on the Western Front, King Kong, Mutiny on the Bounty, Modern Times, Snow White, The Wizard of Oz, and Gone with the Wind.
To me, a director is only as good as the story he has, and only as good as the talent he has in front of the cameras.
Where shall I go? What shall I do?
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a.
But just as it seemed Hollywood's flame could blaze no brighter, politicians in the Eastern establishment, possibly encouraged by a spiteful Edison, hit the movie moguls with a series of blows.
So I just checked into his schedule, and unfortunately, it's just not something that we'll be able to accommodate at this time.
Known as the Paramount case, the first blow was in 1938 when the Justice Department sued the 5 major studios and ordered them to stop block booking and blind bidding.
Basic idea of the Paramount case was that the big studios were engaged in monopolistic practices involving distribution of films, involving control over theaters. And what the Supreme Court was looking into was the set of practices that the studios were engaged in. Were these practices creating monopolies, or were they tending to create monopolies?
Block booking is forcing theater owners to buy packages of movies containing mediocre films in order to get the hit films.
Block booking is really no different than what we have today called bundling. In other words, they bundle cable with internet, with telephone, and they call it bundle. Now, maybe you're not forced to take all 3 of those things, but 50 channels and you really only want 1 cable channel or 5 cable channels, and yet you're forced to take all these other ones. You can't pick your channels a la carte in any kind of a competitive manner where the channels would compete with each other. You basically have to take the whole package of channels. If you wanted Gone with the Wind, you had to take Angry Red Planet or a bunch of other movies that you really didn't want to watch.
Blind bidding is forcing theaters to buy these same packages sight unseen. The suit was partially resolved in 1940 with a consent decree, which allowed the government to reinstate the suit if the studios didn't comply. Unfortunately, the studios did not comply, and in 1943 the case went back to trial and was appealed all the way to the Supreme Court by 1948.
The Supreme Court was looking into the question of whether vertical integration between the producers of movies and the distributors of movies, the exhibitors of movies, if you will, the theaters, were creating a monopoly situation.
Here, the High Court affirmed most of the consent decree's terms, but also ordered the movie moguls to sell their theaters. This single action by the U.S. government, known as divestiture, destroyed the Hollywood studio system and thus ended the golden age of Hollywood. Since the studios were never again able to reliably sell their product, they were never again able to reliably contract talented new writers, actors, directors, producers, or production crews with steady employment.
Here's a conspiracy theory for you. You know, Mel Gibson would even love this one. Edison and Henry Ford got together and basically either instigated or nursed along the Justice Department's Paramount case. Edison and Ford may have been a little jealous of the movie moguls, and it's a well-known fact that the Eastern establishment was pretty anti-Semitic back in these days. So Edison and Ford may have had something to do with the Justice Department's consent decree.
Here is a perfect example of the unintended consequences of government, destroying the delicate economy of an entire industry.
Free market economists look at the antitrust laws and say the antitrust laws themselves are an attempt to limit free market activity in an unjustifiable way from an economic point of view.
The movie moguls had their theaters, their showrooms, chopped off in the name of the evils of vertical integration. Edison and Ford, on the other hand, still had their showrooms for their products, their record players and automobiles. Even though the 1940s saw some great movies, The Philadelphia Story, Fantasia, Grapes of Wrath, Citizen Kane, Casablanca, It's a Wonderful Life, 12 O'Clock High, the Hollywood studios were headed for still more icebergs. After World War II, television burst upon the scene, and by 1950, this new invention fostered a serious drop in movie ticket sales.
Television took a lot of people out of theaters and left them sitting at home watching television. The feature film, was still the bailiwick of the film of the theater. But after the introduction of television, there were less short films and other, non-feature works that were done in Hollywood to be exhibited in theaters.
The movie moguls reacted by circling the wagons and initiating massive liquidations. First, they sold off their priceless collections of props and wardrobes from 50 years of movies that had changed Americans forever. Then they sold off their real estate. Backlots where movies like Sunset Boulevard, High Noon, White Christmas, Oklahoma, Bridge on the River Kwai, and Ben-Hur were filmed. Add to these sad events the escalating massive unemployment due to the breakup of the studio system, and Hollywood talent, staff, and crews were desperate. Eventually, the stars realized they could survive better if they were not under contract to any particular studio. Thus was born the star system, a tough, brutal system where talent fees escalated into the millions and the studios suffered even more.
So suddenly the stars, instead of being loyal to any given studio, were free agents. They were basically hired guns. They'd go from studio to studio, picture to picture, and their agents would basically negotiate for them. In essence, we had the business community injecting itself into the creative community, because if you have agents sitting there basically screening out potential screenplays, then you've got business people screening out the creativity of the thousands of writers all across the country.
Now that creates oftentimes a lot of friction between the creators, the writers, directors, makeup artists, producers, actors, and the business people, if you will, because business and creativity, business and art don't really go hand in hand.
It was only a matter of time before the moguls had to turn to outside financial help.
At this time, we can't say yes. You could try calling back later on this year and see what the status is then.
In Hollywood parlance, an outsider is a wealthy individual or business entity that is attracted to the glitz and glamour of the movie business and wants to participate. At first, individual outsiders like Kirk Kerkorian, Lawrence Gordon, Dino De Laurentiis, Marvin Davis, Ted Turner, and Rupert Murdoch came to Hollywood to seek their fortune as producers.
There's a long history of wealthy individuals, usually, or very talented individuals coming from all over the world and certainly the United States to Hollywood seeking fame and fortune. And these include people like D.W. Griffith, who was an early director on the East Coast and did very well and went out to Hollywood and didn't do so well. He was followed by Joseph P. Kennedy, John Kennedy's father. And he was out in Hollywood for a while and tried his hand at it and didn't do so well.
But individuals only had so much money, and since movies are expensive and difficult to produce, individual outsiders usually ended up broke and then ejected from the Hollywood club. So the moguls turned their attention to corporate investors. Thus, from the 1960s onward, the studios would get in bed with the wolves of Wall Street. Corporations like Gulf and Western, Coca-Cola, Transamerica, Westinghouse, Matsushita, Vivendi, and Seagram's snorted up the Hollywood studios like cocaine. Led by greedy agents, they also became drunk on power and demanded more and more creative control.
The screenwriter or the director are usually adamant about having creative control because it is their canvas that the scenario is being painted on. Rembrandt and Picasso would not like me coming up and taking his brush stroke and trying to initiate a new brush stroke to alter his canvas.
Understandably, the Hollywood studios needed money to make films, but they didn't want unqualified businessmen telling them how to make them. Thus, the successors to the savvy movie moguls that once ran the studios as works of art would have to adapt or fight their new corporate masters. Creative control of the movie industry was now at stake.
You can't query a studio anymore to see if they want to see your script. This has been relegated to the agents, and the agents sit there basically deciding what scripts will be submitted to Hollywood. You're taking 20,000 scripts written every year, subjecting them to the business mentality of the agents, and then only those scripts can get submitted to studios. The creative process of Hollywood studios has been totally preempted by agents, lawyers, and business people.
He has so many previous commitments already that we are looking at several years down the line.
As corporate ownership of the studios became more prevalent, the battle for creative control became more intense and finally gave rise to a new camp known as the Hollywood Insider.
The term Hollywood Insider refers to a small group of people who occupy the most important or most powerful positions in Hollywood. But the main focus of it is on the studio executives, the top studio executives at the major studio distributors. That's the real core of the Hollywood Control Group or the Hollywood Insiders.
People who, for one reason or another by circumstance, have either bullied their way or earned their way into positions such that they can be very intimidating to people who are on the outside.
A Hollywood insider is any person who is a major star, director, writer, producer, powerful agent, personal manager, attorney, or a member of what could be called traditional management. The term traditional management originates from the idea that certain management teams consist of a preponderance of executives that are related to the original movie moguls, their families, and/or close associates.
Traditional management is another one of those terms that's related to Hollywood Insider, Hollywood Control Group, Hollywood Establishment, but it's sort of, by choice of words, it sort of implies, well, there's a long-standing traditional group of people who run Hollywood and control basically which films are produced and released by the major studio distributors, which are in turn the films seen by most people in the U.S. and around the world.
Thus, to understand how traditional management has been able to win the creative control battle against the money men, we have to look at a tactic known as the mass exodus.
Over time, if there are conflicts between the corporate owner of the studio and this Hollywood insider management that they've hired, then the insider management group sometimes would use the threat of a mass exodus. In other words, everybody's going to leave at one time if you don't do what we say. That sort of thing is a threat, and that actually occurred in the history of Hollywood, used against outside corporate interests.
For instance, when Transamerica Corporation bought United Artists, Arthur Krim, Mike Medavoy, and other executives left and formed Orion Pictures. Orion became a well-regarded studio under such leadership as Barbara Boyle, whereas United Artists floundered.
Another example of a mass exodus is when Alan Ladd Jr. left 20th Century Fox when oil billionaire Marvin Davis bought it. They didn't like the way Davis was basically managing the place, even though he was the owner.
Fox had major problems. Given these experiences and many other mass exoduses, Hollywood insiders have been able to defeat the money men. Creative control gave rise to what could be called the Hollywood Control Group. Thus, he who had the know-how and creative control ruled the movie business.
The creative parties in a motion picture want creative control. The people who are bringing the money to the motion picture want ownership control. The creative people in the film industry want creative control because they want to make the film that they envision for their finished production. Whereas the owners, they want something that will give them the greatest revenue.
Well, it's just simply that we cannot accept unsolicited material.
As the Hollywood Control Group became increasingly reliant on outside financing, yet harassed by conglomerate ownership, it began to circle the wagons and stick together more than ever.
I think the phrase control group is generally used to describe a small group of people that have great influence over some activity or some celebrity or some powerful political figure. They're usually in the background. So I think that's what we're talking about when we use the phrase a control group. It's these people in the background who represent a lot of money and also who have a very strong political and ideological objective.
To the outside world, the new corporate executives, who were replacing the movie moguls and even traditional management, seemed cold and less sensitive to traditional American values. There was money to be made and an agenda to be kept. The Hollywood Control Group was becoming predatory, unethical, and even engaged in illegal business practices.
Competition is to a certain extent always predatory. Company A is trying to gain a greater market share over Company B by producing a better product or a cheaper product or a product that is better advertised or whatever, trying to gain that advantage. And eventually, Company B is going to be removed from the process. And one could look at that and say, well, that's predatory, but it's predatory in a good sense because it increases efficiency and consumer satisfaction and so forth and so on. If we're talking about predation that is unethical or illegal, that's exactly the opposite side of the coin. It's an attempt to remove or limit the ability of a competitor to function through some kind of unethical, immoral, improper in that sense, or sufficiently illegal activity.
Yes, the new Hollywood is nothing like the old Hollywood, and the new movies are nothing like the old movies. In fact, by the 1960s, movies with violent and shocking images had become standard. Psychologists might even say Hollywood is now dramatizing all the negative things that have happened to it and its founders, everything from theatrical divestiture to the Holocaust.
Most of the people in the mainstream media, Hollywood, studio system, Their demure to this whole thing has always been and is now, look, we're just businessmen. We're just making money. We're just out to make a buck, okay? We don't care how we do it, okay? And if in the process people think that we're biased or our movies are slanted towards some abstract political philosophy that nobody can really define, you know, that's just fine. Let them think that. Because the bottom line is, people are going to buy our tickets to see our movies, or they're not.
The Hollywood studios became violence-oriented, less tolerant, and politically correct. And now these dramatizations have been institutionalized and funneled through just 6 conglomerates, which own and amplify everything.
The real power is in the hands of the top 3 studio executives, the people who have green light authority over which movies are produced and released. And that's the chairman of the board, some of whom are more active than others over time, and then the president of the studio and the head of production.
3 top executives in each of the 6 studios, plus 3 top executives in each of the 6 networks, plus 3 top executives in each of the 6 conglomerates, and that equals 54. 54 top executives in all. This could now be called the control group of the U.S. mass media oligopoly.
The U.S. mass media oligopoly, which could be said to be comprised of the 6 conglomerates, the 6 studios, and the 6 networks, is basically dominated by 54 males of European heritage.
2% female, six women over time have served as studio executives in those 3 powerful positions. And it turns out again that almost 100% are white. I did a massive amount of research, spent a lot of time over at the UCLA Entertainment Studies, and spent a lot of time over at the Academy Library, which actually had these big 8x11 envelopes filled with press clippings on each of these individuals. And so I ended up with this chart, filling in this chart, and the result was that Hollywood is controlled, if you assume that the power really is in the hands of these studio executives, which I did, that Hollywood is controlled by a small group of politically liberal, not very religious Jewish males of European heritage. Anybody can observe that and report that. USC's School of Journalism and Communications just came out this year with a study confirming that Hollywood was sorely lacking in diversity in terms of race, gender, and ethnicity.
But before one can understand how either the Hollywood control group or the oligopoly control group are promoting the globalist agenda and undermining founding principles, one must understand something about the influences that hit Hollywood shortly after the original movie moguls passed away.
You know, I don't think she's available at the moment. Can I take your number down and I'll pass the message along?
Karl Marx believed that you would have a rebellion by the workers against the capitalist system, which would then create a Marxist communist society in the wealthiest and most industrialized countries. It never happened.
When the workers of the world did not unite behind Lenin's economic political Marxism, certain political scientists got together in Frankfurt, Germany, and formed a research center they called the Institute for Social Research. Later known as the Frankfurt School, this group of Marxist philosophers tried to figure out why the workers of the world did not unite behind economic political Marxism. As Max Horkheimer, one of the school's founders, put it,
Marx got it all wrong. The workers are not up to being the vanguard of the communist revolution. Let's translate Marxism into cultural terms.
By cultural terms, Horkheimer meant cultural institutions like the movies. Workers of the world were more united by the movies they watched than the economic and political institutions they supported.
Every single major mainstream institution has been influenced heavily by cultural Marxism, which is at the core of this movement. This has been an assault on the very character and nature of our country. America was born not as a Marxist nation, but as a nation of liberty and a nation of law, a nation that respected the laws of God, the natural laws of God, the revealed laws of God. Cultural Marxism is polar opposite of those values, and since they have taken over, for the most part, the major mainstream institutions of America, now we are literally inundated with cultural Marxism to the point that we have a generation today that probably wouldn't even recognize it as cultural Marxism. They would recognize it as norm.
Given this turn of events, the Frankfurt School reasoned that the movie industry and all other cultural institutions had to be infiltrated and destroyed. George Lukács.
I see the revolutionary destruction of society as the one and only solution. A worldwide overturning of values cannot take place without the annihilation of the old values and the creation of the new ones by the revolutionaries.
So to get to that point, they said we have to destroy the culture, and what they were talking about was the Christian culture, what we used to call Christendom or Western civilization.
As fate would have it, many of the Frankfurt School's leading lights had to leave for America when World War II broke out. Now safe in New York at places like Columbia University, the school's social engineers began applying their techniques to each new crop of studio executives emerging from the nation's Ivy League colleges. Antonio Gramsci, one of the notable leaders of the Frankfurt School, put it this way.
The civilized world has been thoroughly saturated with Christianity for 2,000 years. Any country grounded in Judeo-Christian values cannot, therefore, be overthrown until those roots are cut.
Gramsci actually argued with a lot of his fellow communists who wanted to take control physically. He said, no, the way to do it is to march through the institutions, march through the churches and through the schools and through the media, through the culture. He actually was in prison, and he wrote a book that outlined his thinking, and his thinking has been adopted by a lot of people.
And sure enough, the Long March eventually saturated the youthful minds of even the Hollywood control group. Screenplays and movies of every possible anti-Christian, anti-family, and anti-capitalist theme now poured forth from Hollywood. And the Long March didn't infect just the Hollywood movie studios. It hit the new radio and TV industries, the theater, the music industry, book and magazine publishing industries, the public school system, and even the clergy.
In the first part of the 20th century, through the middle part of the 20th century, there were a lot of pastors and clergymen and ministers that saw this coming, and they did speak out against it. Unfortunately, as you got into the second half of the 20th century, the clergy, the ministers, the pastors became much more oriented toward success, big buildings, big crowds, big offerings. It became a success-driven ministry as opposed to a truth-driven ministry. And so for the second half of the 20th century and now into the 21st century, the resistance of the clergy and of the church in general is almost non-existent.
Yes, during this long march, traditional values would be replaced with Marxist values, a worldwide overturning of values as Lukács had promised. Eventually, only what's politically correct was to remain. Political correctness is thus the attempt to use speech to control thought and behavior. It's an extension of the Marxist doctrine of equality, but applied to speech. Make speech equally acceptable, tolerable to all people, and thought and behavior can be universally controlled as well.
What that really means is that you're only allowed to express or even hold viewpoints that are accepted in a very narrow box. These are accepted and approved viewpoints, and if you have viewpoints outside of that, you'll be demonized and attacked and marginalized. That's happened to us.
It's sad. Berkeley was the epicenter of the free speech movement in the 60s, holding a sign outside of the archway. Now it is becoming the epicenter of the no free speech movement.
and just advocating, speaking like the founding fathers, advocating limited government, advocating that the government be bound by the Constitution, and advocating that police officers and members of the military have an obligation and duty to refuse unlawful orders, for example. Even that alone is considered to be outside the bound.
If you're told that something is incorrect and therefore you must not speak about it, the implication is that the reason you shouldn't speak about it or use certain words is because it's bad. Well, if it's bad, then if you have those thoughts and you think that it was okay, then there's something wrong with you. You see what I'm trying to say? The implication is, especially if you're just a child in school and you're picking up this concept of political correctness as a child, you're being taught not only what is acceptable, but you're being taught of what is right and wrong. And therefore, you are absorbing the values, the cultural values, the mores of those who are setting the standards.
And nowhere is politically correct thought and behavior more controlled than academia and its spawn, the new corporate Hollywood. Yes, totalitarian in nature, political correctness is not only an enemy of free speech, it's literally a synonym for cultural Marxism itself. And Hollywood was infected big time.
Record your message at the tone. When you are finished, hang up.
The three best-known techniques from the Frankfurt School's social engineers are critical theory, cultural pessimism, and androgyny.
The United States has undergone a cultural, moral, and religious revolution. And a militant secularism has arisen in this country. It's always had a hold on the intellectual and academic elites. But in the 1960s, it captured the young in the universities and the colleges, and we had this great battle, cultural war begin then nationally. And since then, if you will, secularism has really achieved dominance in the academic community and the intellectual community and the entertainment community in Hollywood, among part of the political community, but not the nation as a whole. We won the Cold War with political and economic communism. We've lost the cultural war with cultural Marxism, which I think has prevailed pretty much in the United States, or is now the dominant culture, whereas those of us who are traditionalists, we are, if you will, the counterculture.
So Pat Buchanan is correct, of course. And as I discussed in yesterday's video, the three pillars of our culture that have been hijacked seem to be the mainstream media, academia, and Hollywood, which we knew based upon the intentions, the stated intentions of the Frankfurt School.
Today, corporate Hollywood extensively uses androgyny to indoctrinate the youth. In the simplest of terms, androgyny is the social science of making men into women and women into men. In other words, confusing men and women about their sexuality and their roles in society. The confusion is accomplished over decades of critical but subtle indoctrination about sexual identity and male-female roles.
Hollywood movies today provide a feeding ground for a lot of confusion and a lot of unnecessary false identities for particularly the youth of our country and the world today in terms of their own sexuality and their gender identification. We need to all be respectful of one another and not be judgmental. But when you get to a point where you're questioning which bathroom you should go into, it's really, frankly, in my opinion, reached the point of ridiculousness.
Put another way, almost all Hollywood movies, especially buddy films and coming-of-age films, promote the idea that homosexuality is as prevalent as heterosexuality. Hollywood movies make it all as normal as apple pie. Women going to the office, taking care of business instead of being at home, taking care of the kids. A continuous misrepresentation of traditional male-female roles to the impressionable youth of America.
What they're doing is they're trying to present the aberrant family, the dysfunctional family, as normal. That you should accept this, you should get used to this, you should embrace this, because this is just the way it's done everywhere. When children have the idea that dysfunction is normal, well then you are driving children into a mindset that they will act out those values and those principles which they've learned growing up.
And I think unfortunately a lot of it is perpetrated by Hollywood celebrities because they may feel that they're gay or bisexual or transgender, and they seem obsessed with promoting their activist agenda on the vast public. A public that is naive and is easily confused, particularly amongst young adults and teenagers and even middle schoolers.
Yes, the Long March has been very effective, and movies have led the way. Women endlessly assaulting and shooting males. Bad dads never at home, but out cheating with bad moms. Dysfunctional families with drug-infested kids. The message from Hollywood, the traditional family unit, parents and relationships suck. It's complicated.
It was the Frenchman de Tocqueville who came to our country and he said, America is great because America is good. And if America ceases to be good, it will cease to be great. So cultural Marxism is the introduction into America of pornography, drugs, counterculture type things. In other words, attack the Ten Commandments.
And almost every Hollywood movie carries all or part of this message as if it's some new production code or revenge on Will Hays.
Well, the Will Hays production code, actually that was the motion picture producers production code. And it was something that was developed from the 1920s onwards, eventually goes out in the late 50s, early 60s. It was designed to maintain certain ethical, political, moral, social standards within the filmmaking industry. That in the 1960s, you get people coming along in the production industry who say, well, we want to test the envelope here. We want to start talking about subjects that are outside of these limitations. Right? And they did. And they were essentially successful because the consumers were willing to watch these movies.
In the new code, every Hollywood movie must have characters with at least one of the following attributes. 1. The protagonist and/or antagonist are divorced. 2. The female is dominant, controlling, violent, and/or one-up on men. 3. The male is aloof, feminine, oversensitive, and/or cheating. 4. Somewhere in the family, at least one of the immediate members must be a lesbian, gay, bisexual, or radical women's liber. Often, attributes 1 through 4 are mixed with a touch of schizophrenia, stirred in as males and females swap roles in fluorescence.
The basic unit of a family is where a male has a sex, joins with a female as a sex, and they're able to work together to help each other. And by being able to work together to help each other, they perfect each other, they love each other, they care for each other. And in the process, they learn to love and perfect and care for others within the society. They become good citizens because they're good citizens within their own home, and that produces a society that loves each other.
Again, through endless repetition, Hollywood movies have institutionalized every aspect of androgyny by depicting traditional families as abnormal.
One of the motives behind the common portrayal of a dysfunctional family unit that we see in so many motion pictures comes from the desire on the part of the creators of the movie to challenge the family unit. The family must be eliminated because as long as there's a family, people depend on each other and on the family rather than depending on the state, which means depending on those who rule the state. So I think people who are making motion pictures have probably somewhere along the line read some of these books about how evil the family is, and subconsciously perhaps, maybe consciously, they are writing scripts that portray the family to support this model.
I am now a teacher at a school, at a private school, and a survey was sent out not long ago And the first question was their name. The second question was, which gender do you identify with? And you could identify with either male, female, or neither. Well, I think it's perpetrated confusion among so many people that it's been a very destructive thing in our culture.
Again, Hollywood movies have institutionalized every aspect of androgyny by depicting traditional families as abnormal. Only that which is politically correct is normal.
His schedule is pretty full, especially since we've just stopped shooting this year.
Another fetish of the new Hollywood is to defame senior citizens. Remember that 90-year-old woman who came on camera and cussed right in your face?
That also stiffed me for 2 months' rent when his deposit check bounced.
What purpose could that possibly serve except to invalidate the elderly who tend to respect traditional values? And the elderly are not the only ones. By age 20, our kids have been treated to thousands of movies defaming not just the elderly, but entire populations. Usually it's the Arab, the Muslim, the Latino, the Asian, German, Russian, or African American that's the bad guy in the movie.
Of course, you see a lot of Arabs and Muslims as bad guys in movies, Germans and Nazis as bad guys in movies. Almost to the extent, World War II seems to be one of the real interests of Hollywood movies as opposed to other wars.
And the white guy from the American South, the Christian, the conservative, and the entrepreneur don't do much better.
We got a security problem here. This guy, he shouldn't be there. I know him.
Jerry? One of the movies that I saw years ago, it starred Robert Duvall, and it was Geronimo. And there was a scene in the movie that had Robert Duvall turn to his friends and he said, Texans are the lowest form of human life.
Must be Texans, lowest form of white man there is.
What if a character in a movie said African Americans are the lowest form of human life? Or gays and lesbians were the lowest form of human life? Or what if they said Jews were the lowest form of human life? Would that be funny or offensive?
And at the Academy Awards, it's usually the same old group that gets the Oscars.
Well, I'm here at the Academy Awards, otherwise known as the White People's Choice Awards.
Never much diversity at the talent level because there's not much diversity at the executive level, the place where casting and financing decisions are made.
The control group only permits certain kind of movies to be made. Well, right there, it's basically limits the writers that are going to write these movies because they have to be in conformity with the interests, values, cultural perspectives, and biases of the control group. So descending from the lack of diversity at the control group level, we have a lack of diversity at all the other levels. Immediately, if you have the same people that are greenlighting movies and deciding what movies are going to be made, who's going to be in those movies, you're going to have a lack of diversity at the talent level. So the reason everyone in the Oscars is screaming about a lack of diversity at the talent level is because there's a lack of diversity at the executive level.
There are 0 African American studio heads in Hollywood.
But the problem is they're afraid to say that.
Doesn't a studio head have to greenlight? Don't we really need African American stakeholders in the room?
No, you need people who will make you need production companies that will make the movies.
The facile answer is that the makers of movies are the producers, writers, directors, actors, and crews. So let's take a look at the executive level and see why Hollywood movies have become so politically correct, even championing socialist and Marxist values with impunity.
Is unavailable. Record your message at the tone.
If it's reasonable to theorize that movies tend to reflect the interests of their makers, why would anyone make a movie that didn't interest them, at least to some degree? If this makes sense, is it reasonable to further theorize that movies tend to mirror not only interests, but values, cultural perspectives, and even the prejudices of their makers?
And they also reflect the audience, because a film that doesn't connect with the audience in some way, doesn't really make much money.
Would Tolstoy's War and Peace have occurred had the Russian Revolution not occurred. Okay? So, does it reflect reality, or is it reality reflecting art? Okay? I think it's both.
Well, many of the producers of those movies would say that they are merely reflecting the dysfunctional families of society. I would argue that the abundance of movies that portray dysfunctional families is not consistent with the majority of the American public. It's not as much a reflection of society as it is an attempt by the Hollywood moguls to direct society into an amoral plane that they are choosing for society.
So let's break this down further. Again, the facile answer is that the makers of movies are the producers, writers, directors, actors, and crews. And this is true. These people are the wizards that technically make the movies. The manufacturing process of movies is extremely expensive. In fact, of all human art forms, the production of motion pictures is probably the most expensive. Today, the average cost of a major Hollywood movie is over $100 million, and some movies, such as Avatar and Star Wars, cost over $300 million. Given this, the people who finance movies are extremely important. In fact, if a movie can't be made unless it's financed, the people who finance movies may be more important than the producers, writers, directors, and actors who actually work on the project. If true, for all practical purposes, the makers of movies are the executives that select screenplays and finance their production.
One of the things you learn in the film industry is that writers are told, write what you know. Directors tend to direct movies that they're interested in. Studio executives tend to choose movies that interest them, that sort of align with their cultural perspective. And so anytime you have a narrow group of individuals who are in those control positions, which have the power to determine which movies are produced and released, then it's only natural that those movies tend to, over time, there are always exceptions, but tend to mirror the values, interests, cultural perspectives, and prejudices of their makers, including the studio executives who choose which movies are made and who gets to work on those movies at the top level.
Thus, in reality, movies tend to reflect the interests, values, cultural perspectives, and prejudices of the control group that makes them. But just knowing that the control group is comprised of the three top executives does not explain why Hollywood releases certain movies and suppresses others. We need to explore more closely what the Hollywood control group is interested in. If this can be answered, we should be able to more accurately induce the exact demographic of the control group. For again, movies reflect the interests, values, cultural perspectives, and prejudices of their makers.
The most accurate description of the people who control Hollywood and have for 115 years, it's a small group of politically liberal, not very religious Jewish males of European heritage. I think other people who are less accurate in their description are not doing anybody a favor by misstating the facts or just partially stating the facts.
Earlier, we touched on the observable fact that Hollywood's most blatant patterns of bias are racial, regional, religious, and political. Although Hollywood films originally took a more positive approach toward mainstream religious beliefs, after 1968, films generally began portraying an antagonistic anti-religious slant, especially toward Christianity.
Anything dealing with Christianity or Christ is kind of brushed aside when you've got someone like Mel Gibson who brings in millions, if not billions of dollars as a star, and yet the studios won't give him the money to make a kind of a poignant, beautiful movie about biblical history. And on the other hand, Schindler's List, that got all of the pomp and circumstance and all of the backing that was necessary. So maybe it's not quite as fairly balanced as it should be.
Mel Gibson was determined to make that film, knowing that the Hollywood establishment would never support it, would not fund it, in fact would actually do everything they could to stop it from being produced. And I think to the chagrin of the Hollywood elite, The Passion of the Christ was one of the most successful, one of the most powerful movies that was ever made and will live in movie history forever.
Other than total bigotry towards certain religious groups, Hollywood movies constantly suppress themes that champion the nuclear family, a sound monetary system, non-interventionist foreign policies, free market capitalism, and the right to keep and bear arms. Such subjects are of little or no interest to the Hollywood control group, and in fact threaten it.
Hollywood and the news media, the constant drumbeat is that we're in danger. And you can look at it like, almost like a sitcom or a soap opera. You're being told every day that there's another boogeyman who's going to come and get you, whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda or active shooters. And almost all of these movies and shows will talk about, well, if things are bad enough, then you have to have martial law. There's never constitutional solutions like the people providing their own security. It's always more government power.
On the other hand, movies about travel, food, pets, Hitler, and the Nazis, most replete with nudity and the objectification of women, are of infinite interest to the Hollywood control group. Then there is the ongoing show known as the War on Terror, featuring real-life Arabs and Muslims as the bad guys.
I think the War on Terror can be correctly described as a show, because I don't think it's real. It's not to say that terror is not real, because it is. What it is to say is that it's not what we think it is, and its origin is not what we think it is. Terrorism is largely the product of the people and groups that benefit from fighting terrorism.
The War on Terror is a $4.5 trillion waste of money. We've lost our civil liberties through the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012. All of this goes back to 9/11, and the heart of that matter is at the World Trade Center. If there's any question about what happened, then we've got to focus in on it with laser beam attention.
Hollywood movies today, I'm not so sure in the past, but certainly today, they tend to reflect the goals and the policies of the upper levels of the political system. They tend to be mouthpieces, basically speaking, for Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is promoting the War on Terror. Washington, D.C. developed the Department of Homeland Security in response to the declaration of the War on Terror. And so it's not surprising that Hollywood would glorify that.
And with the War on Terror, Hollywood movies, along with their buddies and the rest of the mainstream media, feel justified in promoting endless paranoia, hence endless need for more security. Now, local police, the National Guard, the FBI, the CIA, the Army, Navy, Marines, and Air Force are not enough. We now also need the TSA and the Department of Homeland Security, a police force modeled after Heinrich Himmler's Department of National Security.
If you want to know what a police state is, watch the news. If you want to know what a police state is, go through an airport and be frisked and have the TSA stick their hands down your pants, claiming that you are a suspect with no evidence. The police state is where everyone is guilty until proven innocent.
So, thanks to Hollywood's endless parade of violence-oriented, terror-ridden movies, we now need endless security in our streets, our restaurants, security at our schools, at the mall, in our homes, even at the toilet, a buzzer with a direct line to 911. And New York City, where so much of this security is now found, is becoming more of a police state every day.
That's unnecessary.
I see the media as actually, the mainstream media as being much more like a movie these days. It's so unreal that it has to be a movie. They are completely scripted, and it has just escalated more and more. I find them completely creating a bizarre reality, if you will, because I don't really see them as reality. And if that is reality, that is pretty frightening to me.
Stop and frisk, police and cameras everywhere, walls and barricades all over. Why would anyone want to attack New York City, one of the largest gun-free zones in America? Oh, wait, the bad guys already have attacked it, twice.
You read the Declaration of Independence, we're living under the exact same type of tyrannical rule, but in some cases it's even worse. We have hordes of bureaucrats out there eating out our substance. A police state isn't just uniformed officers running checkpoints on the highway. It's bureaucrats forcing their way into your home. It's oppressive tax surveillance systems that track everything you do. A police state is what we see America rapidly segueing into today.
So if movies mirror their makers, what kind of a maker would put out movies about endless wars, endless violence, and the need for endless security, other than a group of paranoid studio and network execs that have defamed almost every population on Earth just to make a profit or to promote an agenda?
Please state your name and why you're calling one more time, please.
Yes, the Hollywood studios vilify anything corporate or capitalist. Indeed, Karl Marx, one of Hollywood's A-list writers, made capitalism his #1 enemy. It's therefore no surprise that the #1 swear word in Hollywood is profit, and the #2 swear word is corporation. Is it thus any surprise that almost every Hollywood movie also makes the greedy, profit-driven corporation the bad guy, and the Uncle Sam government the good guy? Atlas Shrugged, a pro-corporation movie based on a best-selling book, was turned down by the Hollywood Control Group for decades.
Ayn Rand wrote a book called Atlas Shrugged. This book was kicking around Hollywood for decades and decades. Even though it was a bestseller, nobody in Hollywood wanted to make it. Why? Because it makes the corporation the good guy. And as we know, in every Hollywood movie, the corporation is the bad guy, and the government is the good guy. The mom and pop government is the good guy, coming running in with the sticker on their back that says FBI, they saved the day. So Ayn Rand's great book, Atlas Shrugged, sat on the shelf for decades and decades. And everybody else was making every other movie bashing corporations, from RoboCop on down to James Cameron's Avatar. I mean, here we not only have corporations in America that are evil, the corporations all over the universe and solar system are.
Their village happens to be resting on the richest unobtainium deposit within 200 clicks in any direction. I mean, look at all that cheddar.
So Ayn Rand dared to make a movie where the corporation wasn't the evil guy, and Hollywood just cannot have something like that.
If the project does not mirror the interests, values, cultural perspectives, or prejudices of the makers, it does not get made in Hollywood. And movies about good corporations do not interest the Hollywood Control Group. Interestingly, profit does interest the Hollywood Control Group, but only if it's their profit and its acquisition does not interfere with the Control Group's political or religious bias. This is why Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ, was not financed by a major studio, even though Gibson is an A-list talent, and his previous pictures have garnered over $1.5 billion in revenues for the MPAA studio distributors.
Movies like that and anything to do with, has any biblical context or any kind of a spiritual message, the studios simply, for the most part, don't get behind.
All said, Hollywood's ostensible disdain for profit and corporations is disingenuous, if not ironic, for the studios, networks, and their parent conglomerates are some of the most profitable corporations on the planet. Accordingly, executives garner some of the highest salaries in the world.
Well, there is a lot of money being made in Hollywood, and it's reported all the time in the press. And a lot of the studio executives and a lot of the top talent are paid significant amount of money, unbelievable amounts of money. But I don't think it's fair to say, well, that's a bribe for being quiet. On the other hand, it is fair to observe that people who are paid a lot of money for what they do tend not to complain.
For instance, in 2014, Rupert Murdoch, CEO of 21st Century Fox, earned $29.2 million. Brian Roberts, CEO of Comcast, earned $31.4 million. Jeffrey Bukes, CEO of Time Warner, earned $32.5 million. Robert Iger, CEO of Disney, earned $34.3 million. And Phillips Dallman, CEO of Viacom, earned $37.2 million. And thanks to the star system and its greedy, rude agents, A-list stars routinely get $20 million per picture. Some more, like Robert Downey Jr., who got $75 for Iron Man, and Leonardo DiCaprio, who got $25 million for The Wolf of Wall Street, another capitalist-loathing movie that dramatizes how big and bad corporations are.
Salaries are certainly not necessarily in Hollywood commensurate with talent or being deserving. Same thing's true on Wall Street. The salaries are totally disproportionate to, the real worth of the talent or the studio head.
So the idea that the movie business is a risky business is simply a conspiracy theory. The Hollywood corporations make as much or more money than any of the big, mean corporations it endlessly depicts.
And a very small portion of the pie, goes to the real creative people who are trying to, present their artistry as best they can, because the bigger portion of the pie goes to the moguls.
And there are hundreds of ways the Hollywood Control Group not only profits, but maintains control over all aspects of its empire. For instance, ever hear of creative accounting or contracts of adhesion?
Creative accounting, this is a term that most of us have heard, and what does it mean? It simply means that instead of following carefully mapped out acceptable standards, known as GAAP, Generally Accepted Accounting Practices, which is used by the whole world, it just basically means that you bring in your accountants and you just let it wing, let it fly, just put the numbers wherever you want and subtract this and deduct that and capitalize whatever you want, expense what you want, anything you can think of to be creative. And if anyone wants to argue with you, then that means they have to go hire their $300 an hour accountant and argue with you. So the studio will sit there and they will fight you with their $300 an hour accountants, and the amount of money you thought you were cheated out of will be basically equal to the amount of money that you will have spent on your $300 an hour accountant.
Hundreds of predatory, unethical, and often illegal business practices used by the Hollywood Control Group over the decades to enrich themselves and to send everyone else into bankruptcy.
Here's what Hollywood tends to do when it loses in court, and I've seen this in several instances. They simply modify their behavior a little bit. Not too much. So block booking is a situation where a distributor goes to an exhibitor. The distributor is represented by an individual. Exhibitor is represented by an individual. They're friends. They know each other. They meet and barbecue in their backyard, and they have an informal conversation that goes something like this. Hey, we've got this blockbuster coming down the pipeline here in the next 6 months, and if you'd like to get that, we'd appreciate it if you'd run these other 2 films too, one of which is okay and the other one's probably not very good. So in my judgment, block booking is alive and well, it's just not formal.
Practices that include unjust enrichment, David Begelman-style embezzlement, reciprocal preferences, cross-collateralization, turnaround, conflicts of interest, false accusations of anti-Semitism, blacklisting, concept theft, monkey points, inflated budgets, contracts of adhesion.
A contract of adhesion occurs when the bargaining parties are basically totally disproportionate. You have a multi-billion-dollar studio basically contracting with a starving writer. The multi-billion-dollar studio is in a position to basically say to the starving writer, here's your contract, take it or leave it. We're paying you $10.99 for your script, take it or leave it. and then suddenly the screenplay produces a movie that makes $1 billion. Okay, so the next time then the studio comes back to the writer and says, hey, will you write another screenplay for us? And the writer says, sure, but I'm charging $10 million for this screenplay.
Contrary to arguments of Hollywood apologists, the cultural Marxist-infected control group does not maintain power because it's smarter than anyone else or more able than anyone else. It maintains power because it uses predatory, unethical, and illegal business practices better than anyone else. It also pushes power to only its circle of insiders.
Employment discrimination can be looked at in two ways. It can be looked at in a good way. I am going to discriminate between two individuals applying for a job because individual A has superior background, skills, and so forth and so on to individual B. So I am clearly discriminating in that case. Discrimination in the undesirable case, socially undesirable, politically undesirable case, is where I choose individual A over individual B because of some characteristic of individual A or B that's completely unrelated to the performance of the job.
We'd like to supply you with a home of your own, a car, a generous bank account, and employment with our company.
I think it's fair to say that some of the studio executives and people who are in high positions in Hollywood are somewhat lucky in the sense that they might have been born into the right family that had family ties to the film industry over the years. After all, there's some of the same families and some of the same cultural cousins or people with a similar background have dominated that industry for over 115 years. And in my view, that's impossible without mass discrimination occurring over this period of time. And this discrimination occurs specifically in the form of nepotism, cronyism, and favoritism.
It's thus no wonder almost every corporation depicted in a Hollywood movie is evil and profit-driven. Hollywood wrote the book on the subject. Now it's dramatizing its own corporate behavior.
Sorry, it's unavailable. Record your message at the tone. When you are finished.
Thanks to the responsible creative control exercised by the original movie moguls throughout Hollywood's golden era, the studios profited by making creative movies that were on a wide spectrum of subjects, as discussed by Ethan Morden in his book, The Hollywood Studios. But today, the corporatized Marxists that infest Hollywood put out any agenda-promoting movie that will make a profit, regardless of how crude, disgusting, exploitive, or puerile the movie is. Ask the executives that greenlit Dirty Grandpa. And needless to say, the number one element in many Hollywood movies is violence, because violence sells, especially in international markets, where the streets now look little different than Hollywood movie sets.
Movies have become actually pretty boring because they're all violent right now. And I remember a time when they were more psychological thrillers. I liked those, the English Gothic films. And then at some point, I would say probably in the late 70s, they moved over from the Twilight Zones and the Night Gallery and the Vincent Price type of films to just complete bloodlust, and there was really nothing to figure out in that, and it has just escalated more and more. I find it so unreal that it has to be a movie.
And in today's world, the role models that are being offered to the young people are not necessarily the white hats at all. They're cynical people. A lot of them have criminal instincts. A lot of them are doing very bad things, and they have, on screen, they show no scruples, they show no compassion, they show no morals, no ethics, and yet they are the role models. Come to Dad. Many of these characters are violent, and that's what makes them, big tough guys. They're really good guys because they're violent. And so that's the image that's being presented, and I think that it has created a generation or more of people who are not sensitive anymore to violence.
I love movie violence. I know that might seem a little strange, but I'm just being honest with myself. You aren't messed up because you make a film about killing. You're messed up if you actually kill.
Yes, the very studio executives that say they are concerned about so much violence in the world and who advise we never forget the Holocaust profit by selling violence to every corner of the world. Is it any wonder the planet is so war-torn? If movies reflect their makers' interests, why are the makers so interested in violence? Does Hollywood breed global violence and terror? Many feel it does. It certainly profits from global violence and terror. Jack Valenti, past president of the MPAA, said that movies are mere entertainment. Is he right? Are movies mere entertainment? Entertainment that happens to reflect the violent world in which we live? Not according to 1,000 studies that have come out over the past 40 years. According to them, movies cause violence.
You see active shooters on the screen, then you get copycats who decide they want to go out like that, they want to be famous. And of course the media, when it's an active shooter, instead of withholding the guy's name and denying him that fame, they instead put his name and his face all over the cameras, and that just makes them want to do more of that. If someone's unstable and wants to go out and be in the history books, they know that they can count on the media to put their face and their name all over the place and pass it back and forth, 24/7.
By the time our children are 18 years old, they have seen over 20,000 murders and 200,000 violent acts in the movies.
And part of the reason is that feeds the bigger agenda, curtail your right to bear arms, curtail your freedom, have more surveillance of all of us.
The violence in movies affects the child's brain. When there's a lot of killing in movies, children don't see that there's a consequence to it. And often the villains that are portrayed are stereotyped. You could take whatever's bugging the government or some particular group of people and put them as the villain, and then there you go. You start conditioning the person that this particular group of people is dangerous.
Thanks to Hollywood, our kids have learned to not only hate old people and dads, but moms, families, girlfriends, boyfriends, seniors, Latinos, Arabs, Muslims, Asians, Germans, blacks, Christians, conservatives, profit corporations, free markets, competition, capitalism, and even the U.S. Constitution.
The first principle in the U.S. Constitution is limited government. And it's certainly not my perception that what is coming out of Hollywood today in any way champions limited government. If anything, it champions the extension of government in whatever area you can imagine, from the war on terror on the one side to government intervention in public education, healthcare, and so forth and so on. There's very little that comes out of Hollywood that you could say is informed by the principles of the Founding Fathers. So if you look at it from the terms of those principles, I would say no, Hollywood generally does not support the United States Constitution.
Our kids have also learned how to be stress-free on the pharmaceutical drugs advertised endlessly on network TV while mass murdering their classmates in the Hollywood-promoted public school system. How does this happen? Ben Badikian, author of The New Media Monopoly, says bluntly that media power is political power.
Aren't there examples, and might not Brooke Shields be an example of someone who benefited from one of those drugs?
All it does is mask the problem. You're here on the Today Show.
Right.
And to talk about it in a way of saying, well, isn't it okay, and being reasonable about it when you don't know.
I've lived with these people, and they're better.
So you're advocating it?
I am not. I'm telling you, in their case, in their individual case, it worked.
Drugs aren't the answer. That these drugs are very dangerous. They're mind-altering, antipsychotic drugs.
Most politicians never criticize the mainstream media. They know the New York or Hollywood control group can make or break their careers.
Well, I think it's self-evident that media power, in the broadest sense of media, is political power, because how does one obtain political power in a democratic system where you're trying to influence voters? It's through their interaction with news, entertainment, opinion leaders, if you will. And how do those interactions occur? Well, it's through some form of media. Whether in the 19th century it was newspapers, and in the 20th century comes radio, television, motion pictures, internet. So the more a particular political point of view is able to operate through those media and influence individuals, the more that political point of view will tend to gain prominence and control.
We don't accept any unsolicited materials. I'm getting a call on the other line. Can you hold for 1 second?
And speaking of careers, Hollywood is the only industry in the world that has enslaved its unions and guilds.
Any union or guild is supposed to serve the interests of workers, and it should be open to all workers. But that's not the way it is in Hollywood. In Hollywood, the unions and the guilds are basically under the domination of the studios. And by that, I mean that they act as the screening agents for the studios. The agents also act as screening agents for the studios, and this would include the agents that are signatory to the Writers Guild.
Sure, the unions and guilds are there to protect the workers' careers, but only a handful of workers, the ones that get to work on signatory productions.
Very difficult as to talk about who they actually serve. If you go up and audition for a film, if you're not in the Screen Actors Guild, your agents probably can't get you in the door. So you have to hope that you meet somebody along the line and says, listen, I want to give this kid a break. And then you get a job for a minimal amount of money, but you get your SAG card, your Screen Actors Guild card.
In effect, the unions and guilds sign contracts with the studios that result in a soft collusion that bars millions of workers from employment in the motion picture industry. These so-called signatory productions thus form a cartel of discrimination that screens out talented new actors, writers, crew members, and filmmakers with a sophisticated network of carefully designed catch-22s. For instance, production agreements stipulate that one can't work on a signatory production unless they're in the union or guild. But one can't get in the union or guild unless they have worked on a signatory production.
It's a catch-22 because you can't really do a union film if you're not in the union, and you're not allowed to really do non-union work, so it's very difficult. They keep a lot of people out. It's hard to earn your stripes and get that first break as a cinematographer or as an actor or whatnot, in a movie or a TV show.
And ever try submitting a screenplay to Hollywood or one of its nasty agents? It's almost impossible unless you know someone. Yes, at the advice of their paranoid lawyers, the new Hollywood studio executives now accept no unsolicited screenplays from the thousands of talented authors and writers across the nation. And even if you call one of the studios, agents, or signatory production companies to query them for interest, a time-honored practice, they consider that very call unsolicited.
Well, it's just simply that we cannot accept unsolicited material.
In other words, they got to call you up and go, yo, James, we hear you got a whole bunch of scripts out there. Let's start sending these puppies in. We need some scripts here at ABC Studios. Unless you put out a best-selling book and you're a best-selling author, Hollywood is not going to solicit your screenplay.
And good luck getting anyone on the phone. You can't even talk to anyone at a studio unless you know the specific name of the person you're calling. Yes, writers with fresh, original concepts or a diversity of unique stories can go to as far as the Hollywood studios are concerned. The Hollywood Control Group makes sure only its little bevy of studio-approved, union-bribed writers get the job.
Nepotism, cronyism, and favoritism are simply forms of discrimination that have been used in Hollywood over the years to maintain control over the industry for, again, over 100 years, which I think is an absolute impossibility without discrimination. So nepotism is hiring someone because they're family. Cronyism is hiring someone because they're friends. Favoritism is hiring someone based on some arbitrary factor that you favor. And in this sense, it tends to be people who are like the people who are in control.
Is it any wonder almost every Hollywood movie is a clone of almost every other Hollywood movie?
If you limit the number of writers that you are willing to employ. You're going to limit the number of stories that are being told. And in my view, you're going to limit the breadth of the viewing audience that you can attract to your films. I suppose that people interested in ownership control want to limit the writing staff in order to control the messages that are being sent out in their productions. But it also may limit the size of the viewership and therefore limit the revenue that your pictures bring in.
And want to produce a movie in Hollywood? Surprise! The star system is there to drive you crazy and then suck every penny from your bank account before spitting you out. In short, a studio won't finance your project unless you have one of its overly paid name talents officially attached.
You've got to get a director, a name director attached to it, or a name movie star. And that's really, really difficult. So as a result of that, there's a lot of really talented projects that might come to fruition and be incredibly successful projects, never get to see the light of day.
But here's the catch-22. A name talent won't officially attach unless the project is already set up, studio speak for financed. Thus, in order to get a movie financed in the new Hollywood's star system, you have to already have financed the movie yourself with outsider money. In short, the publicly owned movie corporations discriminate against the public by refusing to do business with anyone who is not a Hollywood insider.
It could be argued that in a free society, you should be free to discriminate any way you wish, as long as you don't injure a person. But in a broader sense, we all should seek to be discriminate. We need to choose. We don't want to just choose our friends. Put up values there and stick by them, and pass by people that don't meet your values and your criteria. That's a good thing. So it depends on how the word discrimination is used, and in the field of Hollywood, I suppose you could argue it either way.
Many of Hollywood's business practices amount to blatant discrimination and restraint of trade, and this is why a serious lack of diversity exists at every level of the movie industry.
Restraint of trade is any limitation on trade using the free market as the standard. Are we preventing consumers from exercising real choice over products? Are we preventing producers from offering products to consumers?
One doesn't have to be Nostradamus to predict that most of the people that work on the Hollywood movies are not Latino, not Arabs or Muslims, not blacks, Asians, or females, not Christians, and especially not conservatives. And guess what? You can be sure the control group is no different, because all of the employment discrimination descends from the control group itself.
The phrase lack of diversity, which I use in my writing, is simply talking about the fact that there are not a lot of different kinds of people, racial, ethnic, gender, at the top in Hollywood. As I said, we're talking about 2% women. I think one African American. There were no African Americans in my original study, one maybe since then in those studio head positions, or those top 3 studio positions. No Latino, one Latino, I think, in my study, out of 226 people. No Native Americans, no Asian Americans. That's a real lack of diversity in Hollywood.
In summary, with the demise of the studio system, Hollywood's modus operandi has been to circle the wagons, build huge walls with guarded gates, and establish a bunker mentality that rejects not only all the unsolicited screenplays, but all unsolicited people, places, and things. Hollywood even rejects the very concept of diversity itself, and this is why everyone is screaming at the Oscars.
When you are finished, hang up or hold for more options.
We've looked at the Hollywood-based movie studios and how they indoctrinate the youth, defame whole populations, and use unethical, predatory, and illegal business practices to keep the control group in power and deem everyone else unsolicited objects. Now let's take a look at how the New York-based mainstream media has expanded Hollywood's predatory business practices to indoctrinate and control us when we are older. This is where the real action takes place because after years of processing from politically correct Hollywood movies, the average young adult is now willing to swallow almost any lie about any person, company, or presidential candidate that is promoted or demonized by the corporate fascists in the New York network's control group. Yes, TV advertising is very expensive. Thus only billionaires, large corporations, unions, associations, super PAC-funded candidates, and governments can afford fees of $5,000 to $1 million per minute. Only the rich, therefore, get to advertise and promote their products, causes, and issues on network TV.
In Hillary Clinton's America, the system stays rigged against Americans.
The amount of money it costs today to run for Congress or even to run for president is obscene. And most of that money goes into television commercials and spots and all of the mass media advertising that needs to be done to reach a vast number of people. Therefore, the media becomes the client of the government, or at least the person who's running for office. And when that person wins, if the media has supported him, naturally he wants to pay them back. He may not think of that consciously, but in appropriating licenses and expanding territories and allowing them to own more than one media outlet, that's exactly what happens. As a result, the number of media companies, as we said before, has concentrated in a few hands. And unfortunately, Congress and the media work together to present an image to the American people that does not always include every aspect of the truth.
The public thus gets advertisements, programs, and so-called fake news that endlessly distort reality by spinning issues to align with the agenda of the mass media control group. This means American citizens are exposed to a very selective and narrow spectrum of products, issues, and causes on network TV.
Anderson, this is a significant development.
Let's say we're talking about some applicants for employment as anchors on a news program, major media news program. And so here we have three, A, B, and C, and they're all equally talented. They would all be capable of performing that function. One is a conservative, one is a moderate, and one is a liberal. And if the choice by the media mogul who's hiring these people is, well, I'm going to take the liberal because I want to promote a political ideology. I want to use my media power to promote that type of political policy. Would we say that's restraint of trade? Well, it's not restraint of trade perhaps in the economic sense, because the person who is chosen, the liberal who is chosen, has the ability to perform that job equally with the other two. But it's restraint of trade in these ideas. And if you think of the media as having some kind of duty to the public, to provide a broad spectrum of political ideas, some kind of political diversity, you'd say, well, yes, this is a kind of restraint of trade.
Let's take a look at some of the products, issues, and causes we do see in TV advertisements, on the evening news, and in various programs to the exclusion of all others. Some of the products we see ad nauseum are pharmaceutical drugs, oil-burning cars, debt-peddling banks, sickness-exploiting insurance, brain cell-killing liquor.
6 major conglomerates that control almost all of the mainstream media, and they're right in bed with big pharma, and right in bed with the big defense contractors. Who do you see advertising on TV? It's pharmaceutical companies, it's the car manufacturers who are being subsidized by the U.S. government. So you've got these major corporations that are all in bed together. They're in the club, like George Carlin said. There's a club, you're not in it.
Rarely or never seen are vitamins, electric cars, guns for self-protection, fusion, solar, or anything Nikola Tesla invented or would have approved of.
I don't think no country worldwide will have real freedom before free energy and free uncontrollable communications. That's when freedom will come. More than 100 years ago, Tesla was talking about this. And I don't think what's really happening, why we have to send all these troops out to protect pipelines and produce all these weapons, get in a war for energy, get communications controlled that much, and spend billions of the dollars when we can really have our own energy here and other countries can have, or we can just take energy from Amazon, distribute to the earth, standard of the living will be perfect and everybody will be free. That would be really freedom.
Issues constantly pushed are gun control, but never the militia of the several states. Gay marriage, but rarely traditional marriage. Keynesian economics, but never Austrian economics.
If people care about peace and prosperity, they have no choice. They have to go with free market Austrian economics, and they have to give up on regulations and economic controls by the Keynesian ideas.
Socialized medicine, but never free market competition in the health industry. Radical women's lib, but never stay-at-home moms. The living constitution, but never the original intent of the founders. Incarceration for drug users, but rarely rehabilitation. Big pharma-assisted psychiatry, but never meditation or pastoral counseling.
The reason why so many people are on pharmaceutical drugs today, specifically psychiatric drugs, is because the psychiatrists are convincing the public that they have a brain abnormality with no science, no facts, just based off of checklists. It's very subjective. So the marketing has been that there's something wrong with your brain, when in fact, there's no science behind it.
Depression, a serious medical condition affecting over 20 million Americans. While the cause is unknown, depression may be related to an imbalance of natural chemicals between nerve cells in the brain. Prescription Zoloft works to correct this imbalance.
And the drugs actually hurt the brain, and the drugs increase violence, cause psychosis, mania, and this is a terrible thing that is happening to the public. So it's false advertising.
Including risk of suicide may occur.
Other side effects may include dry mouth.
The most common side effects are dry mouth, headache, constipation, and abdominal pain. Or dizzy when you stand up.
Headache, diarrhea, and abdominal pain could be side effects.
And as far as causes, the mainstream media endlessly pushes the progressive cause, but rarely the conservative cause. The Democrats are heroes, but the Republicans are villains.
You know, the activists, gang up on the conservatives and vice versa, and that exists within the studio system as well. And the media drives Hollywood and has a big impact because they do all the promotion of all this activist agenda that we see creeping into our television series today and most of our movies.
Donald Trump is unfit for office, but Hillary Clinton is what America needs. Collectivism is for the greater good, but individualism is selfish. Multiculturalism is the future, but assimilation is xenophobic. Socialism is good, but capitalism is evil. Cooperation is desired, but competition is Darwinian.
The 20th century taught any lesson whatsoever. It was that socialism was not only unworkable, but that it was vastly destructive. Right? Killed millions and millions of people, caused wars and so forth and so on, economic collapse, you name it. Socialism was an idea that should have been proven by the 20th century to be completely useless. And what do we have today? Well, the major media people, they're still promoting socialistic ideas.
Welfare is more important than national defense. Globalization is good, but anything else is isolationist. Tariffs are bad, but taxes are a godsend. Secularism is sane, but religion is loony. World government is progressive, but national sovereignty is fascist.
I think the United States should say to other nations, look, we've built a pretty good deal here. We've got a pretty good thing going in this United States of America. Why don't you adopt what we've done, right? Here's a copy of our Constitution. Take it, use it, right? And we'll get back to using it more ourselves while you're doing that as well.
Big government is necessary, but limited government is obsolete. Political correctness is proper, but all else is hate speech. Gold and silver are archaic, but fiat currency is modern. As one can see, there are many products, issues, and causes the mainstream media promotes and suppresses. It would be difficult to cover all that's suppressed, but these things could be classified as ideas, inventions, and innovations that stand between our current stagnant civilization and what our civilization could be, with the power of creative individuals not truncated by media trolls on the bridge to liberty.
So James, I'm going to take down all your information and pass it along to the right person.
It seems that the criteria the mainstream media uses to determine what it will promote and what it will suppress can almost be summarized in a single word: collectivism.
Collectivism is merely the broad description for an ideology that is based on certain principles, but the main one being that the group, the collective, is more important than the individual, and that the individual should be sacrificed, if necessary, for the greater good of the greater number. And if you can get that concept in your mind that, wait a minute, it's not a question of numbers, but of human rights and the dignity of an individual. And then if you say that the individual is the cornerstone of society and that to protect the rights of the individual, if you can do that, that is the greater good for the greater number, then you're on target again.
The control group operates on a collectivist philosophy, an anti-competition, anti-free market philosophy that promotes the central planning F.A. Hayek warned us about in The Road to Serfdom.
If people care about peace and prosperity, they have no choice. They have to go with free market Austrian economics, and they have to give up on regulations and economic controls by the Keynesian ideas.
The collectivist is thus always seeking to maximize profit through consolidation, a consolidation he justifies by economies of scale. The problem with this smokestack economic theory is that it relies on globalization to increase stockholder value rather than innovation. In other words, the globalist seeks profit by selling more of the same tired products across global markets than attempting to produce new and better products through innovation. So the obsession with consolidation is actually a pathology of the collectivist mentality, dramatizing the desire for endless profit through endless domination.
Why is it a leap of belief or a conspiracy theory to think that the very entities and corporate lawyers that have consolidated hundreds of movie companies and distributors down into 6 entities are not the same mentality that wants to push a globalist agenda, an agenda to consolidate the 160 or 80 nation states down to one huge nation? It's all consolidation, it's all collectivism, or as C. Wright Mills put it, the power elite, the control group of the planet Earth, if you will.
As related by media expert Ben Bagdakian, we've seen how hundreds of media companies were consolidated down to just 50. And then, by 2004, those 50 were further consolidated to just 5. Today, as we've previously seen, we stand at 6.
If you go back about 100 years ago, the National Banking Association and others put out reports saying we need to buy up the media because it was diversified then, and it was anti-establishment, pro-constitution on average, very populist though. They said, we're going to buy this up and basically get it to where there's no real investigative journalism going on, and where the establishment is given a free hand to do whatever they want, a get out of jail free card. And that's what the dinosaur media is. That's my name for the mainstream media. They're a group that lies incessantly. They're a group that spins. They're a group that is engaged in repeating the press releases that they're given by select corporations and government. They're basically the propaganda corps for the globalist.
Mainstream media, CNN in particular, does not care about the public outside of their indoctrination mission to eliminate borders and basically destroy the nuclear family.
You have 6 major media corporations or conglomerates in this country today. Too much consolidation results in stultification. And then the stultification actually feeds back and allows for greater consolidation.
Additionally, those of us that are privy to CNN's bullshit don't watch it anyway.
And their product tends to be more or less uniform. Are political ideas uniform? No. Economic ideas? No. Social ideas? No. So where is the competition? If you don't have competition in the system, then by hypothesis you have monopolistic or oligopolistic situation.
The mainstream media, if not actively imploding, is at a very minimum really worried, and they see the writing on the wall.
Given the pathological obsession the collectivist has for consolidation, why would word processor crazy corporate attorneys not apply the same mentality to the consolidation of governments, even governments across the world?
They seek to create a stagnant system where no one can threaten their monopoly. The mainstream media is the deceptive propaganda arm of the megacorporations and governments that are monopoly men, that are social engineers seeking for a managed, controlled economy where risk is made public, we have to pay for it, but profits are private to them.
World government, the ultimate merger, is the epitome of the globalist agenda. And the success of such an agenda depends on the cooperation of world populations in something called free trade. Thus, America and every nation's population must be indoctrinated by the mainstream media into accepting so-called free trade, what Pat Buchanan calls the Trojan horse to world government. But as we've all seen, the so-called free trade foisted upon us by globalist bodies is really managed trade. And this managed trade has been endlessly promoted by the New York media to the point whereby it has now destroyed not only the U.S. manufacturing base, but much of the American middle class.
We find that in the motion picture industry today, all of the subtle little signals and the messages that are built into the storylines supports the concept that collectivism is a good thing. And it's a very subtle thing, and I'm sure, many people don't get these little messages and signals because they're not familiar with the concepts we're talking about. And so indirectly, their attitudes about their political place in the world, whether collectivism is good or individualism is better, what kind of a system do we really want to live under? These concepts are being eroded or actually being poisoned by the subtle messages that come out of Hollywood.
Karl Marx would be proud. Earlier, we covered cultural Marxism, the Frankfurt School's gift to Hollywood's executives and America's youth. Now let's take a look at corporate fascism and see how both of these brainwashing technologies are ultimately totalitarian and ultimately leading young and old down the road to serfdom.
An email address. I'm getting a call on the other line. Can you hold for 1 second?
Sure.
The term corporate fascism means the merging of corporate and state power, such that corporate power prevails.
We saw fascism in Second World War when the state and the corporates merged. However, the state basically was the supreme power. Today's new corporate fascism, we could say the corporations basically dominate the state. And the way they do that is by literally purchasing the state. They buy up all the media and the advertising so that they can get their political representatives into power. They fund the campaigns of congressmen, and they basically filter these people into the Congress to pass laws that are favorable to the corporations. So today we have a unique form of fascism known as corporate fascism.
Recall that cultural Marxism means economic, political Marxism translated into cultural terms. Again, both corporate fascism and cultural Marxism are totalitarian in nature and thus require big, if not unlimited, government, whereas the U.S. Constitution calls for limited government.
Both cultural Marxism and corporate fascism are totalitarian in nature because both worship the power of the state. Either the power of the state to force you to be a certain way, that's the cultural Marxist viewpoint, and the corporate fascist way is, well, to control your economic livelihood, They control what you can and can't do for a living. They want to control your choices. So both of them believe in big government, believe in transnational corporations, believe in the economic power being taken out of the hands of the people, believe in unrestrained government for their own particular uses.
Given this, corporate fascism requires the media conglomerates to be overly cooperative with the state, which always wants to expand. Yes, the globalists are hell-bent on using the mainstream media and its two ugly wings, the cultural Marxist-infested Hollywood studios and the corporate fascist-infested New York networks, to reduce the United States to but a province in their one-world government.
The largest, of course, would be the United Nations. And a lot of other globalist organizations that we know of that exist, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and all these, they're all subsidiaries of the United Nations. What is their purpose? Their purpose is to take control of the planet. I lament the fact that many people in our country had not ever read the Constitution of the United States. But far fewer people have ever read the Charter of the United Nations. Article 25 of the Charter of the United Nations, very small, one sentence. It says, all members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council. As a member of the United Nations, therefore, the United States has agreed that we will accept the decisions of the Security Council of the United Nations. Forget the Constitution. There's a subsidiary of the United Nations called NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. How did we get into Iraq? Well, we got into Iraq because of a United Nations resolution. So globalism, no thank you. Independence, yes.
Recall, the Supreme Court found in the case of Burston versus Wilson that motion pictures are a significant medium for the communication of ideas, and these ideas can affect attitudes and behavior in a variety of ways. By this, the court implied that motion pictures are so powerful they don't just influence individual behavior, they can influence all of society's behavior.
The mainstream media facilitates the globalist program of disarming the people by demonizing gun owners, by implying we're terrorists, by implying we're guilty for what bad people do with guns. And they basically push this unified front that you're bad because you believe in the Second Amendment that this country was founded on. 1776 happened because the redcoats came for the ball and powder. They came for the guns. So the truth is the people demonizing the Second Amendment are the real enemies of the Republic.
If this is true, that our behavior can be shaped by movies that are mere entertainment, shouldn't we be concerned about what the control group at conglomerate headquarters has planned for our news and entertainment?
There are a lot of people over the years in Hollywood who, in response to criticism from various interest groups, when they complain, Hollywood will step up and say, somebody there, including Jack Valenti and other MPA executives and other studio executives, will say, oh, well, movies are just entertainment. You know, don't take it too seriously. That is one of Hollywood's big lies.
The prudent citizen would say, we the people need to start getting concerned about what ideas we let some control group in Hollywood and New York put into our minds. And if movies and media really do reflect the interests, values, cultural perspectives, and prejudices of their makers, do we the people agree with the makers' vision of a global government? A one-world state where America is gone, where everyone is disarmed, where we watch endless TV commercials about the merits of debt, government insurance, and fossil fuel-burning cars as we kill our pain with Big Pharma's pills.
They show drug commercials of a happy family, and they depict what your world at home looks like.
It complements what I'm already doing.
In order to convince you to buy their product. So they are trying to change your behavior. They're trying to take something that is not in your daily life and sell you what they want to be in your daily life.
Ask your doctor about Prestique.
Is this the world we want? The plan being promoted by the mainstream media and its globalist agenda?
Well, that's exactly why I'm asking you
you to give me your phone number, and then I will pass this message along to his assistant.
Nowhere does the control group in the New York media shine brighter than in their reality show known as the War on Terror. The War on Terror, more accurately known as the War of Terror, has been running on network TV since 2001. Basically a massive co-production between the mainstream media, the military-industrial complex, and the Federal Reserve Bank. The show co-stars not only members of the control group, but neocons, war hawks, the CFR, Zionists, and big oil execs.
Well, the whole war on terror, the drumbeat of fear since 9/11, 16 years of warfare, has definitely made money for the major defense contractors, for Halliburton, for the people that build all the body scanners, for all the surveillance equipment that the NSA uses on all of us. This is, we're talking billions of dollars, big, massive corporations making a lot of money on that fear, on the fear point of the war on terror.
One of the longest running shows ever, the War on Terror, has made the Washington establishment, the New York media, and the global power elite trillions of dollars. Banks that finance wars, military contract companies that build the weapons even ISIS uses, oil companies that fuel the whole machine, all advertised on network TV.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Historically, we see that crises are used all too often to justify an expansion of power. And that's something that right after, say, 9/11 had occurred and the Patriot Act was put forth, it's understandable that people are going to be more willing to give up some of their freedom and their ability to control what the government does, because there's the horror of that moment, the sight of watching buildings collapsing on 9/11 that made many Americans much more susceptible to the argument that we need to be stronger.
And the revenues are hundreds of billions of dollars, as well as hundreds of billions more to Big Pharma. After all, the War on Terror hurts a lot of people, and these folks then need Big Pharma's product to heal a lot of people. Also, wars always divide and stir up voters. And there is nothing the mainstream media likes more than millions of angry, hostile voters, for angry, hostile voters demand angry, hostile presidential candidates, and angry, hostile candidates tend to buy more angry, hostile TV commercials.
Wake the f*** up! I'm Jeff Wagner, I approve this message.
For a free society to succeed under the conditions we have today, in spite of all the bad moves, if you have freedom of choice as an option, we'll be okay, like a freedom of choice in medical care. And this is why Obamacare was such a threat, because they were trying to get rid of all choices, and you have to have a choice to get out.
You have ignored us. I have called your office incessantly, and I get people who don't know what's going on. I don't get any return phone calls. If I ever fax or email, I get a form letter.
Education, you should have this too. Homeschooling and private schooling represents this option to get out, because they do quite well. And the state-run schools are very embarrassed, and they hate them because it embarrasses their system because they don't do so well. And they're handicapped by the political correctness in the courts and the federal regulations. So the atmosphere is just horrible for a learning experience.
So churning up domestic and world events and promoting the wars and terrorists that result from such chaos are quite profitable for the control group that dominates the mainstream media.
I can pass it along to his assistant, but I cannot guarantee you anything.
No discussion of the mainstream media would be complete if its relationship with Israel were ignored. This subject is known as the third rail of politics because no one wants to touch it.
The third rail of politics. Well, there's probably more than one, but the biggest one is probably the Israel issue. Now, you cannot touch Israel without dying professionally, politically, etc. That would be the third rail that anyone in the entertainment business, anyone in the news business, the media, anyone in politics. The Israel issue would have to be the granddaddy of the third rail issues.
I mean, we had a couple of knockdown, drag-out fights, you might recall, talking about those in Congress that support Israel. I didn't like that comment, but we had a debate about it.
There are elements in our society, and they're predominantly on the hard left, that say it's no longer enough to challenge and contradict and defeat or fight these fellows in arguments. We got to smear them, stigmatize them as racist or homophobic, and then we got to silence and censor them. And the way we do it is go after the media outlets that put them on the air, or get them off your network. Otherwise, we're going to go after the advertisers. I think they're engaged in a blacklist, Sean, a blacklist of conservative and traditionalist thought.
We can discuss it here because this documentary is probably not coming to any movie theaters near you. Even still, this documentary does not profess to be a treatise on Israel or to take any sides. All we want to do is make the point that almost every anchor, pundit, politician, and celebrity that appears in the mainstream media totally and uncritically supports Israel.
Anybody that watches this show knows that if I want a key to the city of Tel Aviv, I can get it. I'm about as pro-Israel as can be.
This is amazing, for there does not seem to be this degree of agreement in almost any other human endeavor.
No, I don't know, but I do know who's responsible for it, and that's Hamas.
If there's an event, for example, a terrible tragedy between Israel and the Gaza Strip, Palestinians there, and people are killed on both sides, if that's presented in a certain way, your sympathy as a viewer on this side of the television screen, your sympathy can be thrown toward Israel or toward the Palestinians, depending on how it's presented. And it's hard to be objective in a situation like that and present some cases where it looks like this time around this side was the aggressor, but the next time it looks like that side was the aggressor. And when we do that, we always get mail from people who are committed to one side or the other. They're not interested in facts. All they're interested in is which side are you on?
Other media outlets like the BBC in Britain, RT in Russia, the NHK in Japan, and Al Jazeera in Qatar have a much broader spectrum of news and opinions about Israel.
Israel vows to shut down Al Jazeera, accusing the network of incitement in its coverage of the recent protests.
Why is this? Why does the control group of the New York media and the Hollywood-based movie studios only permit a politically correct discourse with regards to Israel?
Hollywood is run by Jews. It's owned by Jews. And they should have a greater sensitivity about the issue of people who are suffering.
Is Brando right? We know that the original movie moguls were mostly Jewish, but since the conglomerates now own the studios, is Hollywood still run by Jews? Abraham Foxman, former national director of the Anti-Defamation League, addressed this question vis-a-vis Mr. Brando's comments.
It was shocking to hear Marlon Brando, an acclaimed actor and champion of civil rights, invoke an anti-Semitic canard that Hollywood is run by Jews. Mr. Brando should know that what he said is utterly false. Hollywood studios are owned and movies are made by men and women, some of whom are Jewish, many of whom are not. Those Jews who entered the movie industry have done so as individuals, not as representatives of their religious group or with an aim to act in some coordinated conspiratorial manner.
We agree with Abe Foxman. Jews in general do not run Hollywood. Thus, Jews in general should not be blamed for any sort of coordinated activities or conspiracies that the mainstream media may or may not be involved with.
Oh, I just wish my Jewish associates in the movie industry would, they come up to me all the time. They say, hey, James, I'm Jewish. How come I don't get a job running the studios? I put in my resume and they won't let me or Marvin Davis run anything in Hollywood. And remember, Marvin Davis was not only Jewish, he was a multi-billionaire.
Recall when insider Alan Ladd led the mass exodus from 20th Century Fox after Marvin Davis had acquired the studio. Yet even he, a multi-billionaire, could not get in to run Hollywood any more than any other outsider, whether Jewish or Gentile.
So Abe is right. Jews in general do not run Hollywood.
These things acknowledged, along comes Ben Stein and E-Online magazine.
First, it is extremely clear to anyone in Hollywood that Jews are, so to speak, in charge in Hollywood in a way that is not duplicated in any other large business.
It's not fair to say that Hollywood is run by Jews, Jews in general. That's not a fair statement, and I think my studies show that, and that's misleading. And so people who talk about conspiracies or suggest that all Jews are somehow involved in the film industry is not true. There's a lot of Jews all over the world that have no interest whatsoever in what goes on in Hollywood.
So what's the reality? Ever since Neil Gabler, who happens to be Jewish, wrote a book entitled An Empire of Their Own, How the Jews Invented Hollywood, it's been common knowledge that Hollywood was established and run by Jewish movie moguls.
When you look at the leadership of Hollywood, the management, the top-level executives, we recognize that the Jewish elite no more represent the rank-and-file Jewish people than the political elite represent the rank-and-file American voting public.
But some will ask, given Hollywood was established over 100 years ago, how could it still be run by Jews?
You still don't get it, do you, boys? There ain't no countries anymore. No more good guys. They're running the whole show. They own everything, the whole planet. They can do whatever they want.
Most of the original Hollywood moguls were of Jewish heritage, were Jews. And today, about 70% of the control positions, of the power positions in Hollywood are still maintained by these politically liberal, not very religious Jewish males of European heritage. So that's over 115 years or so of continuous and constant control of a very important communications medium by a very narrowly defined group. And my contention is that that's impossible without massive discrimination.
Of the total U.S. population of about 230 million, only about 6,800,000 are Jewish Americans. Thus, Jews represent about 2% of the population. One would therefore expect that only about 2% of the positions in top management of the studios, networks, and conglomerates would thus be held by men and women, some of whom are Jewish, as Abe Foxman put it. Nevertheless, this does not seem to be the case, according to Michael Medved, who observed in the 1996 August edition of Moment magazine the following.
It makes no sense at all to try to deny the reality of Jewish power and prominence in popular culture. Any list of the most influential production executives at each of the major movie studios will produce a heavy majority of recognizably Jewish names.
Hollywood is predominantly run by the Jewish community, and they are the lords of Hollywood for the most part, and they yield a lot of power. And God forbid you should buck that power or in any way say anything from the other point of view, you will immediately be labeled as being anti-Semitic and not part of the crowd, the in crowd. And that's just the way it is.
And then Joel Stein, writing in a December 2008 issue of LA Times, elaborates.
Joel Stein, as a proud Jew, I want America to know that of our accomplishment. Yes, we control Hollywood. Without us, you'd be flipping between the 700 Club and Davy and Goliath on TV all day.
So Neil Gabler says Jews invented Hollywood. Michael Medved says they are a heavy majority. Ben Stein says Jews are in charge, and Joel Stein says they control Hollywood. At least 4 prominent individuals from the Jewish community say, in essence, that Hollywood is run by Jews, just as Marlon Brando stated in 1996.
Hollywood is run by Jews. It's owned by Jews.
If it's true, it would mean that those Jews run Hollywood. It doesn't mean that all Jews run Hollywood. And it doesn't mean that the ones who do run Hollywood are doing so as Jews.
So, Jews in general do not run Hollywood. However, about 60 to 70, 80% of the top executive positions in the studios are dominated by Jewish males.
Then along comes Seth MacFarlane, hosting the 2013 Oscars, and Gary Oldman in a 2014 magazine interview, both Gentiles.
Mel Gibson is in a town that's run by Jews, and he said the wrong thing.
You guys have made some beautiful, some inspiring movies. I made Ted. What about you? You got a Berg on the end of your name. Are you Jewish?
Am I Jewish? No, actually, I'm Catholic.
Wrong answer. Try again.
What?
Look, you want to work in this town, or don't you?
After hearing these comments from MacFarlane and Oldman, Abe Foxman and Rabbi Marvin Heyer of the Simon Wiesenthal Center took immediate action.
Every comedian is entitled to wide latitude, but no one should get a free pass for helping to promote anti-Semitism.
What he did at the Oscars was offensive and not remotely funny. It only reinforces stereotypes which legitimize anti-Semitism.
I do not think it is anti-Semitic to simply observe the facts as they exist in reality and report them accurately. Most people seem to be afraid to state the truth and sort of dance around and do the PC thing or whatever. And so I'm simply trying to state the truth, and which are supported by the facts.
Anytime one wants to thwart investigation into some area, the race card is brought out, and the apologists of Hollywood use the cry of anti-Semitism anytime someone wants to reform Hollywood or investigate its business practices. Is this really acceptable in a democratic society where the free flow of information is vital?
When Neil Gabler, Ben Stein, Michael Medved, and Joel Stein, all Jewish, say Hollywood is run by Jews, they get a pass from organizations ostensibly representing the Jewish community. Yet, when major stars like Marlon Brando, Mel Gibson, Gary Oldman, and Seth MacFarlane, all non-Jews, even joke that Hollywood is run by Jews, they're reprimanded. Is this fair?
But again, that's all that we can do. The person who takes this request is not here.
It seems that Neil Gabler, Michael Medved, Ben Stein, Joel Stein, and Marlon Brando are right. But if Jews enter the movie industry only as individuals, not as representatives of the religion or of the Jewish community, as Abe Foxman says, why do organizations that seem to represent the Jewish community, such as the ADL and Simon Wiesenthal, attack individuals who are simply expressing their opinion about who runs Hollywood?
Yeah, the ADL and similar organizations who seem to take it upon themselves to demonize, vilify, and even destroy anyone who dares to make an objective, much less critical analysis of anything Jewish, I think demonstrates a tremendous bigotry and bias. I mean, this is supposed to be a country in which free speech is not only tolerated, but encouraged. The idea that we all must think the same thing and we all must say the same thing is not consistent with American history and American liberty. Our country was founded and framed on the idea of contrary thought and public debate, taking ideas into the marketplace. That's been the American tradition, and so now over the last few decades, all of that is out the window. If you say anything contrary to whatever the accepted philosophy is at the moment, then you are worthy of disgrace.
In a democratic society where freedom of speech is guaranteed by the First Amendment, should acclaimed actors, or anyone, have to cry and weep before the Hollywood Control Group and its magistrates for stating what anyone can observe or confirm on the Internet?
A couple of years ago, I released the film Passion. Now, even before anyone saw a frame of film, for an entire year, I was subjected to a pretty brutal sort of public beating. And during the course of that, I think I probably had my rights violated in many different ways as an American. you know, as an artist, as a Christian, just as a human being.
4 out of 6 CEOs at the major studios, 5 out of 6 CEOs at the networks, and 4 out of 6 CEOs at the conglomerates are Jewish. Simple math tells us that if 60% of the 54 CEOs in the control group are individuals who happen to be Jewish, a small group of Jewish males not only runs Hollywood, they run the New York networks and the conglomerates. They, in essence, run the entire mainstream media.
When Abe Foxman said that Hollywood is represented, many of them Jewish, he wasn't exactly being truthful. So really, he's putting the Jewish community at risk when he falsifies the number of Jewish studio executives that actually are influencing the selection of motion pictures in the movie industry.
Not only that, a small group of politically liberal, not very religious Jewish males of European heritage has run the Hollywood studios for over 100 years.
My argument is it is not appropriate for any narrowly defined group, don't care who it is, to control an important communications medium like the motion picture. If you had a group of Southern Baptists running Hollywood, a group of African Americans, a group of Native Americans, we'd be seeing different kinds of films. There's no question about that, because again, movies tend to mirror the values, interests, cultural perspectives, and prejudices of their makers. So that really then tends to be sort of private propaganda, private censorship being employed.
Even though these are the facts, it is important to remember the distinction articulated by Abe Foxman that Jews enter the movie industry only as individuals and not as representatives of their religion or the Jewish community.
But the minute you have someone like Abe Foxman saying that Jews don't operate in any kind of concerted manner, yet you have an organization that represents Jews in general, such as the ADL, chastising somebody like Marlon Brando, you in essence do have Jews in general influencing at least the knowledge and perception of Hollywood. So you're invoking the Jewish community. Anytime you represent the Jewish community in something like the ADL or the Simon Wiesenthal Center, you're basically making Jews in general look like apologists for the Hollywood movie industry. And if the Hollywood movie industry is using predatory practices or discrimination to stay in power, a lot of people are going to blame the Jewish community for this.
Those Jews who entered the movie industry have done so as individuals.
But even as individuals, there are implications. For if movies mirror their makers, as we previously covered, the implications are well stated by Michael Medved.
The combined weight of so many Jews in one of America's most lucrative and important industries gives the Jews of Hollywood a great deal of political power. They are a major source of money for Democratic candidates.
Is this not almost exactly what Ben Bagdikian, the Supreme Court, and John Cones are saying? Media power is political power, and movies are an important communications channel that mirrors the interests, values, cultural perspectives, and prejudices of their makers.
I think it's self-evidently true, as John Combs said, that the makers of movies are going to reflect their own interests, values, prejudices, and convictions, if you will. It's obvious that's the way most people operate in general. You're certainly not going to produce a movie that reflects someone else's values that are antagonistic to yours. So the mainstream media promotes the globalist agenda, number one, because they believe in the globalist agenda, the control group. But I think number two, indirectly, to the extent that they promote ideas that are subversive of popular power, popular sovereignty, local control. The consequence of that is to aid globalist machinations.
Pennsylvania goes to Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the President of the United States.
Everybody is crying.
And since most Jews are Democrats and most Democrats are liberal, would this not explain why we have a liberal media?
You're awake, by the way.
How do we explain how this is possible?
This was a white lash.
The only checks and balances we have are us, the view.
Hence a media that calls for such things as the endless infringement of the Second Amendment with all manner of regulations.
Do you think it's time to take a look at assault weapons and discuss possibilities of changing laws pertaining to them?
So, given these things, we come back to the question of Israel. How many of the top executives in the networks and studios are prejudiced in favor of Israel? In short, how many executives in the mainstream media control group are Zionists?
There is another reason the media is liberal. Movies are creations of art. And when you're making a fantasy or a creation of art, you're always trying to push the limits, okay? So by the very nature of art, by the very nature of movies, they're going to be liberal. They're going to be progressive. You're going to progress into new areas. You're going to explore the fringes and the outer extremities of existence.
If 60% of the network, studio, and conglomerate CEOs are Jewish Zionists, this may be why anchors, pundits, politicians, and celebrities all tread carefully around the third rail of politics, Israel, the Jewish state.
The Jewish leadership in New York City media and in Hollywood is extensive, as we've already discussed. And would that be the reason why free thought is not allowed on the subject of Israel, whether it be on the talk shows, the newscasts, Hollywood itself? Yes, I think the answer is an emphatic and obvious yes. That's the reason.
The issue is whether we the people should be concerned when none of our political candidates can get coverage from the mainstream media unless they're uncritically pro-Israel. Many American voters and taxpayers do not feel the U.S. should be involved in Middle Eastern affairs as much as we are. Look at what our involvement has already done. Caused wars, 3,500 American lives, 4,500 civilian lives from drone attacks.
And when you have a group of people, I don't care who it is, that refuse to allow another group of people the opportunity to even express themselves without the fear of the destruction of their way of life and their livelihood, is totally, totally foreign to anything this country was built upon.
$5 trillion in debt and taxes, the deaths of millions of indigenous people around the Middle East, the rise of ISIS, and worldwide threats of terror. Now even terrorist attacks on American soil.
I don't think every political candidate, or most political candidates, take a pro-Israel position, or at least say that they're pro-Israel, they're going to defend Israel, Israel is our greatest ally in the Middle East, or whatever. I don't think they all say that because there's Jewish influence on them. They say it because that's what those people in their constituencies believe. Of course, the media people, they're hired, and they don't have much of a chance because there's employment discrimination, in a sense, there, right? They're going to be hired by control group people who are favorable to Israel, and therefore, they need to be favorable to Israel, and they'll get the job.
If the control group were comprised of fewer Zionists and more Arabs or Muslims, would coverage of Israel be more balanced? Would the U.S. military be stationed all over the Middle East?
Unfortunately, because of the stranglehold over the entertainment industry, over the news industry, the New York media, and the Hollywood industry itself, it's almost impossible for people who have differing opinion to be freely able to express it. That is the problem. That's one of the major problems in the mainstream media today.
If a candidate is vilified by the mainstream media for taking a stand that is not politically correct, is it okay that the candidate will probably be ostracized, hence never get elected?
And Congressman Ron Paul is with us tonight. It's an honor to have you, sir. You're a leader of a movement. Sometimes you remind me of my hero growing up, who was in fact Barry Goldwater.
Oh,
and then I grew up.
The problem is the lack of diversity, not the fact that they're Jewish, or the fact that they're liberal, or the fact that they're males. None of the factors in the demographic are the problem. It's the problem of all of the factors aligning in a combination that locks the control group into a certain pattern of thought, a certain pattern of interests, cultural values, beliefs, and prejudices.
This idea that government will take care of me,
no, but
that means that somebody will.
Doesn't the person have to take responsibility and buy health insurance?
What would be the reaction of many people in Hollywood today if all of a sudden we said, 60% of the upper management in Hollywood and the top level executives were, let's say, Muslims, what would be the reaction to that?
There's a revolution going on, Chris.
Until we allow people to be free, to be able to express themselves, their talents, their abilities, their thought, their philosophies in a free and open debate, until we have that, let's face it, we're in an oppressed society.
So you're with Matrix Productions, correct? And you're doing an interview on Hollywood.
Again, as Ben Bagdikian says, media power is political power. Thus, the mainstream media is, to a greater or lesser degree, dictating the politics of the nation. The Second Amendment and Israel being two major examples.
The mainstream media does dictate the politics of the nation by giving the American people a false choice. You must support only the Republican candidate, the anointed candidate, or the Democratic candidate, and very often they're much the same. So for example, they'll shut out someone like Ron Paul, who wanted to go back to free market economics, limited government, states' rights, a limited false choice. You're not given the libertarian or the more constitutionally based alternative. The difference between Barack Obama and George Bush when it comes to their destruction of the Bill of Rights is almost indistinguishable.
There's a certain amount of friction between the two, but in the basic question of how the political structure in this country is supposed to run and who's supposed to control it and what is considered to be within bounds and out bounds, they agree essentially 100%. Because they're all essentially in it together. Big finance, big media, big politics. They're all part of the same operation.
If this is true, the question arises, in a democratic nation, is it acceptable that a small group of executives, any group of executives, not just liberal executives, secular executives, Jewish, Christian, or Muslim executives, are able to dictate who we the people vote for? If the answer is no, then these things should happen. 1. The conglomerates that own, influence, or dominate hundreds of alter ego media companies across America should be broken up through Sherman antitrust laws already on the books. 2. The narrowly defined group of executives that comprises the control group of the conglomerates, networks, and studios should be encouraged to diversify. 3. The Internet must be kept free, open, and universal, and no control group, no matter what demographic, must ever be able to influence or dominate it.
The Internet is really our last best hope for free exchange of uncensored information. And if it's to remain that way, it will become the primary weapon to break the grip of the collectivist New World Order. The one thing that these people fear at all is the continuing expansion of the flow of information and the ability for the average person to break away from mainstream media and dig out information on their own. I think that is the thing that they must guard against at all costs. And we see a lot of maneuvering going on right now so that the powers that be can control the Internet in the name, of course, of fighting terrorism and fighting crime and child pornography and all these other things that are offered to get us focused on the concept that, yeah, it's a good thing to have control over the Internet, not realizing that the real goal is to censor political and social information and economic information. The Internet is already in the hands of political national and international political forces, and there's a struggle now between American control versus United Nations control over the Internet. It seems to be that nobody's really arguing that no one controls the Internet. They're now just trying to see which political body is going to wind up with the control, and that is not a very healthy sign. We have to be aware that no one must control content, at least not content, and at least not who participates in the Internet.
Again, emphasizing what the Supreme Court said in Burston, motion pictures, and this includes the mainstream media, are a significant medium for the communication of ideas, and these ideas can affect public attitudes about politics.
These anchors and various other mainstream media people are antagonistic to the internet because the internet has taken away their authority and their market share. And so it's only natural that the mainstream media will try to dominate the internet.
And do that regularly now. Also, as part of this equation is the fact that by limiting the amount of ideas that are exhibited, they can limit the knowledge and wisdom and understanding of the viewership.
So if you're running for political office and you do not feel it's in the best interest of Americans to send billions of dollars to Israel every year, weapons to Saudi Arabia, make war in Iraq, or let radical Muslims into the United States, is it okay if the mainstream media destroys your career by labeling you a racist, bigot, anti-Semite, or isolationist?
As someone who ran for president of the United States in 2008 as a third-party candidate, we are not given a fair and free hearing. The American people are not even allowed to hear our ideas. We're not allowed on the talk shows. I don't care whether it's Fox News or CNN or MSNBC. We're not allowed on. They didn't let Cynthia McKinney on. She represented the Green Party. Bob Barr was the nominee for the Libertarian Party. Obviously, there are a lot of libertarians. You have a mainstream elite that are purposely, deliberately suppressing free thought, free ideas, free and open debate. And they are creating a monopoly of ideology, a monopoly of expression, a monopoly of speech, a monopoly of thought.
America went into war in Iraq largely because the mainstream media promoted that war. Did the mainstream media promote the war because members of the control group wanted the U.S. military stationed around the Middle East so it can protect Israel in the name of protecting oil fields?
Well, the mainstream media can impact our viewpoints because we're being bombarded 24/7 with radio and television and cable networks, 24/7 news, and people tend to put this on in the background, or it's playing when you're going through an airport terminal. It's playing on the screen. You're constantly being bombarded whether you want it or not. So you're being hit with a drumbeat of, well, here's the accepted opinion, and you're not being shown alternatives. So it's always you're being hit with, here's how you should see the world. Here are the solutions you're limited to. Here's the right way to think.
If one reviews a cross-section of studio movies, they can easily observe that Hollywood has a very cozy relationship with the U.S. military. The military, in fact, pretty much allows the studios carte blanche with its equipment and logos. Tanks, fighter jets, submarines, FBI, Signia, all over the actors' blazers. Given these subtle quid pro quos, Hollywood and the New York networks could very well be influencing the U.S. government in ways voters may not approve or in ways that benefit globalist interests over American interests.
The internet is basically the absolute free flow of all points of view in the civilization. Anyone and everyone can represent their viewpoints, opinions, values, cultural perspectives, and prejudices over the internet.
How often is some pundit or anchor up there blindly praising Israel?
And so the mainstream media is either going to become more like the internet, or the internet is going to become more like the mainstream media. If the internet becomes more like the mainstream media, we'll start to limit the information and discourse that can be on the internet.
8,000 Americans total, altogether with these wars, spent $4 trillion, increased the national debt, 40,000 people injured, hundreds of thousands needing medical care. Before 9/11, we were spending $40 billion on security. And now it's over $80 billion they spend on it, and the Department of Homeland Security is expanding and TSA is expanding. So they've done everything completely wrong.
It's so bad the U.S. empire now has 900 military bases in 140 countries. This includes battleships and tanks peppered around Arab holy lands, ostensibly to protect Saudi oil, the very oil that makes their occupation of the Middle East possible. And Saudi Arabia, who gets much of this protection for free, is supposed to be our friend, at least according to the mainstream media's oil and car advertising clients. Yet 15 of the 19 hijackers that ostensibly flew jets into New York buildings and the Pentagon were Saudis. Yes, the mainstream media gets billions in ad revenues from big oil and oil-burning car companies, so there is no way it can truthfully report on the relationship between the King of Saudi Arabia, the people of Saudi Arabia, and we the people of the United States.
So why do we have endless wars? We went into Desert Storm in Iraq under a United Nations resolution. We went into Iraq again the second time under United Nations resolution. We're in Afghanistan today under NATO, another subsidiary of the United Nations. So why do we have endless wars? I've just explained to you. What's the answer to it? Get out of the United Nations and never go to war except with a declaration of Congress. And a congressman from Texas stood up and he said, Mr. Chairman, I have a motion. It was Ron Paul of Texas. He said, my motion is that we declare war on Iraq, and I intend to vote against my own motion because I don't think we should go to war against Iraq, but we should not ignore the Constitution that says no war unless there's a declaration of war. And the International Relations Committee voted 45-0 against Ron Paul's notion. So is our foreign policy all upside down? Yes. What should the foreign policy of the United States be? George Washington said, commerce with all, entangling alliances with none.
Again, the war on terror has not only cost the American taxpayer $5 trillion and the deaths of 3,500 Americans, it's destroyed the lives of millions of innocent Arabs, Muslims, Afghanis, and Iraqi people. To this, fans of Hollywood movies and the New York media's hit TV show, The War on Terror, simply slouch back in their couches and think, so what? Arabs, Muslims, Afghanis, and Iraqis are the bad guys.
You're doing an interview in Hollywood and you want to see if he'll shoot a 1 hour segment.
So the hit TV show, The War on Terror, keeps the oil and Israel lobbies protected, the military-industrial complex fat with contracts, the drug companies spending on TV spots, and the control group execs rich with some of the biggest paychecks in the world. But who is the executive producer of the show? Easy. It's the Federal Reserve System. The guys that print up the Federal Reserve notes to pay for the guns, bullets, tanks, drones, executive salaries, TV ads, and oil.
It would be impossible to go to the taxpayers of any nation and say, well, we're going to have a war now, a war on terrorism or a war against another country or any kind of a war. So starting next month, everybody has to kick in another 8% of their income, thank you. Well, there'd be a tax revolt overnight. The only way these wars and these great expenditures and these bailouts and all this legalized plundering, the only way that can be done is if the money is created out of nothing, which means it's fiat money. Because without the Federal Reserve, without the ability to create money out of nothing, there would be no way for any of this to be financed.
Bear in mind, the Federal Reserve is little more than a cartel of elite bankers that are based in New York City, right down the street from conglomerate headquarters and the United Nations, global headquarters for the one world totalitarian government now under construction.
So it's very easy for that system to finance essentially any expenditure that the government wants to engage in. The other way to finance warfare is through borrowing. But as soon as the government comes into the market and starts borrowing, it drives up interest rates. As the expression goes, it crowds out the ability of other people to borrow, and this has economic effects. What's the percentage of the Pentagon budget, military budget in this country? It's about 50% or slightly more than the total budget of the country. Could that really be financed by taxation and borrowing in a free market system? Would the people be willing to pay those levels of taxes? And would the market be willing to accept those levels of interest rates? Doubtful.
Yes, the Federal Reserve System is using unconstitutional fiat currency to fund the globalist agenda.
It is the fact that the Federal Reserve is the facilitator, that you couldn't have big government. If everybody loves big government, love the Fed, because they can finance the wars and all the welfare you want, but it doesn't work. It eventually ends up in a crisis.
That's right. The media control group ignores the Fed's violation of Article 1, Section 8 and 10 in order to facilitate infringement of the Second Amendment.
Well, you know, the Second Amendment says the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And a number of years ago, I actually came up with a t-shirt that said, "What part of infringed don't you understand?" And I was asking that to all the lawmakers in the country who pass gun control laws, because it's not that hard of a word to get. So I looked it up, and the synonym that I really like the most with infringe is hinder. You can't hinder my possession of firearms. Do background checks hinder my right to keep and bear arms? Do waiting periods hinder my right to keep and bear arms? Do all these other regulations about what kind of gun you can own, how much ammunition you can own, and all these other 20,000 gun control laws in this country now, do they hinder the right of law-abiding citizens to keep and bear arms? Absolutely they do. They're all unconstitutional. They're all infringements. And let's be real clear here. We're talking about the supreme law of the land. The Bill of Rights is the supreme of the supreme laws of this country. Gun control in the United States of America is against the law.
Well, the power of the purse and the power of the sword is important. The power of the sword, I would assume that when you have a right to national defense, and the founders recognized that, that was one limited authority that they did get. But the power of the purse is to restrain those people who abuse it. If the president does too much and fights a war that is undeclared, the people, through the Congress, should restrict that by taking the money away from them. My question is, Mr. Chairman, whose responsibility is it under the Constitution to manage monetary policy? Which branch of government has the absolute authority to manage monetary policy?
The Congress has the authority, and it's delegated to the Federal Reserve. That's a policy decision that you made.
Yeah, but they can't transfer authority. You can't amend the Constitution by just saying we're going to create some secret group of individuals and banks. That's amending the Constitution. You can't do that and all of a sudden allow this to exist in secrecy. So the founders made an attempt to keep the power with the people, and the most important body would be the Congress, especially the House of Representatives. They can stop all this. Only the House is supposed to legislate tax bills and spending bills, not the President and not the Senate. So this to me is a power that we've been neglecting, though, because the President does what he wants, and once he gets involved in a war that they shouldn't happen, I said, yeah, he shouldn't have done it. But we can't desert the troops. A patriotic person can't say, bring the troops home. So they play on that, so they stir up the trouble, and then they use those arguments to get the money that they need. But the power of the purse should be the ultimate weapon against this government power.
So here's the conclusion. If a documentary does not support the globalist agenda, if it is not partisan, if it does not fit neatly into the demo-publican football game, then it does not get funded or promoted by the mainstream media.
Why isn't the media addressing the findings of an international team of 8 scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen, which finds throughout the World Trade Center dust, what amounts to about 10 tons of material that shouldn't be there, red-gray chips about 1/16 of an inch long, the ingredients of thermite, set in an organic bed of oxygen, silica, carbon, which is designed to be the explosive or the force-inducing expansion of gases in products like TNT. This should not be found in the World Trade Center dust. This is made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. Why isn't the media investigating those laboratories?
This should tell us something. The New York-based networks and the Hollywood-based studios, what we were referring to as the mainstream media, are not looking for truth, nor are they looking after the folks. They're looking to guard their clients' interests, usurp political power, and promote the globalist agenda. Every time there's another mass killing by some nut on Big Pharma's mainstream media-promoted product. Predictably, the same pundits and same candidates with the same tired arguments come on screen and recite another litany of reasons why right to keep and bear must be further infringed.
The school shootings actually are the rise in the use of psychiatric drugs on young children developing minds. The marketing has skyrocketed. We now have television commercials, and on the commercials they're advertising psychiatric drugs and therefore driving up the demand. And the school shooters, the common denominator is that they've all been on psychiatric drugs.
And I think that it's pretty obvious that without any sensitivity towards it, probably is on pharmaceutical drugs, if not psychiatric drugs. When one considers that the 6 major networks derive billions of dollars in advertising revenue from pharmaceutical companies, is it any wonder that every time after a mass killing, we never get to find out exactly what manufacturer of the pharmaceutical drugs the killer was on? The mainstream media is not looking after the folks without informing the public exactly what drugs are being used when these killers go out there and do their deeds.
And gruesome Hollywood movies that dangerously desensitize those who struggle with mental health challenges. Entertainment moguls don't have an absolute right to glorify murder while spreading mayhem in young minds across America. And our Bill of Rights does not guarantee gun manufacturers the absolute right to sell military-styled, high-caliber, semi-automatic combat assault rifles with high-capacity magazines to whoever they want.
So why is this? And why especially does one never hear the word militia on the mainstream media, except in a pejorative manner?
Well, I think the federal government, in large part, and along with the mainstream media, fear of people who are armed and independent, can provide for their own security, and who might also be able to resist their oppression. They want to make us like people are in other third world countries where there's the ruling junta and the military beneath them and the police, and then there's all the peasants.
As we explained before, the control group is made up mostly of liberals who are of European heritage. Except for the banking capital of the world, Switzerland, Europeans do not have the right to keep and bear arms. Thus, the concept of a militia system is alien to them.
The power of the sword is the police power inherent in we the people. And we must regain that power by having militia laws in each state.
The second reason is that because the mainstream media promotes the globalist agenda, it does not want to give platform to the practicality of gun ownership or local protection through a well-regulated, well-trained state militia system.
If you're talking about local militia groups, almost by hypothesis, you're talking about separate nation states. And of course, the global system wants to eliminate all national structures. Right? There aren't going to be any borders anymore. There's going to be one great global government and then some, local or regional sub-governments.
It is a big idea, a new world order, where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause.
And then number two, as soon as people function in a militia structure, they realize they are the ultimate political power. They do not answer robotically to someone at some higher level in a removed capital someplace. Ergo, we can't allow the people to have those kinds of institutions. We have to remove those institutions.
They never show the crowd. They never show the crowd. Show the crowd. See, they don't want to turn around. Look at the cameras, they face straight.
So the mainstream media promotes the globalist agenda, number one, because they believe in the globalist agenda, the control group. But I think number two, indirectly, to the extent that they promote ideas that are subversive of popular power, popular sovereignty, local control. The consequence of that is to aid globalist machinations.
The control group at conglomerate headquarters and the globalists at the United Nations all know that were the mainstream media to acknowledge that the highest law in the land stipulates the idea that state militia are necessary for a free state. That would not fit in comfortably with the idea of a global government or a disarmed citizenry.
Increasingly, the attitude of a citizenry toward what their government should and should not do is affected by the movies they see and the television programs they see. And the messages are sometimes subtle in the story that this is how it should be or how it must be. And increasingly, we see police acting in a very violent and brutal fashion. And this is the storyline, because they're fighting against very bad people. So the concept is, well, as long as you're fighting against very bad people, then you can also be very bad. And in fact, you have to be if you want to defend the good people out there. This is kind of a subtle message that increasingly we see all the time in movies and television programs. That what we used to call police brutality is now just what police have to do because they're opposing very, very bad people. There's a serious question as to whether or not a free people can even know that they're losing their freedom if their concepts of what is the proper function of the state are constantly being affected by this kind of treatment.
Of course, the control group will always remain armed. It's just the pesky citizens that need to be disarmed, just like they've been disarmed in most other countries in the old world order. Stalin's Russia and Nazi Germany are prime examples.
They want civilians disarmed, that they believe in a monopoly of force for the government. And so the gun control lobby is a wholly owned subsidiary, mainly of foreign, multinational, offshore banks that have already conquered Europe and most of the world, and they're coming in here taking over the United States.
Since movies and news shows mirror the interests, values, cultural perspectives, and prejudices of their makers, the interests of the control group are that the people should never have guns, let alone a militia. The values of the control group are that gun control is more important than gun rights. The cultural perspective of the control group is that guns were outlawed in Europe's Old World Order. Thus, they should be outlawed in America's New World Order. The prejudices of the control group are that ordinary people are incapable of safely and responsibly keeping and bearing arms, and thus their participation in the state militia system is unwise.
Yeah, I think it's very important that people are allowed to be armed, and some people argue that being armed will increase crime, but there's no evidence for this. And actually, this whole idea of a permit for concealed carry, it's better than not being allowed to own a gun, but it really isn't a solution. Everybody should have this right to conceal it or not conceal it. Ultimately, this provides a safer society, and I think some of these rampages could be stopped in the middle of them. And some of the strongest proponents in Texas came from people they've lost families because nobody was there with a gun that could have stopped some madman.
The astute citizen will see that it's a serious liability to the national interest when makers of movies, the gun control group, do not reflect we the people in our diversity and in our agreement with the highest law in the land, the U.S. Constitution.
Could you give me a little bit more info on what the movie is about?
In this documentary, we've seen why it's important for there to be diversity at all levels of the mainstream media, both in the Hollywood movies, on the nightly news, and in other mass-disseminated shows and programs.
A democracy depends upon ideas and people arguing and kicking things around and theorizing, and conspiracy theories flying, and people agreeing or invalidating, arguing and hammering out the truth. So that to the degree the trolls on the bridge to liberty, the control group, truncate the information flow to the civilization, we don't have a complete set of information to make decisions with.
The thesis of this documentary can thus be boiled down to the following simple, if not axiomatic, points. 1. Movies and media are powerful influences on human behavior. 2. Movies and media reflect their makers' interests, values, cultural perspectives, and prejudices. 3. If the makers of movies and media are a narrowly defined group, the movies and media such group will promote will also be narrowly defined in scope. 4. Democratic society depends on an informed citizenry and a wide scope of ideas and solutions. 5. Any powerful communications channel that limits the free flow of information acts as a restraint of trade on the marketplace of ideas.
The free communication of ideas, even dissent, is essential for the survival of a free system. If you can clamp down on the exchange of information, even information that you don't think is appropriate and that you wish didn't exist, if you can do that in the name of the greater good or in the name of decency or political correctness or anti-hate or any excuse that you can come up with that sounds good, you are infringing on the free flow of ideas. You may disagree with the fact that they're wasting a lot of money and that there's a $20 million that just disappeared in $100 bills, and you have a feeling it went to the contractors, and you've got information and they say, you are an enemy of this country. What are you, for the terrorists? Are you questioning our military, our honorable men in uniform? You need to go to prison because you are opposed to this country. You are unpatriotic. You know, they can come up with all kinds of ways to accuse dissenters of being bad people, when in reality it's just a cover-up for crimes and corruption that are being perpetrated. So because of that reality, we must keep the channels of communication open.
Diversity should thus be at all levels of the mainstream media, talent, crew, executive, and corporate, but especially at the executive level where creative control and financial decisions are made.
But here's the real question. The real question everybody wants to know. Everybody wants to know in the world, is Hollywood racist? You're right, Hollywood's racist, but it ain't the racist that you've grown accustomed to. Hollywood is sorority racist. It's like, we like you, Rhonda, but you're not a Kappa. That's how Hollywood's, yeah?
I think the concept that is hard to get across to people is the concept of diversity and a narrowly defined control group. They think that by calling for a narrowly defined control group's diversification, that we are criticizing or invalidating any particular element in that demographic. They think that the call for diversity in the control group is an attack on secular values, liberal values, males, Judaism, or European heritage. They take this as a personal attack that if we say that the control group of Hollywood studios and networks is too narrowly defined, meaning everyone in it, not everybody, but 60, 70, 80% of the 3 top executives are liberal, secular, white, Jewish males of European heritage. We have 5 factors that are exactly the same in 70%, maybe as high as 80% of the people that control the studios and the networks. They think that we're attacking these people, that we're bigoted or biased or anti-Semitic. No, the issue is not any particular thing that these people are, because there's nothing wrong with having liberals and progressives and Jews and whites and people of European heritage in the control group. But when 70% of them, 80% of them are all exactly that, we got a lack of diversity problem, Houston.
Which means this whole no black nominees thing has happened at least 71 other times. Okay? You gotta figure that it happened in the 50s, in the 60s. In the 60s, one of those years, Sydney didn't put out a movie.
When 6 conglomerates are staffed by talents, crews, and executives of any narrowly defined group, we the people will be subject to the interests, values, cultural perspectives, and prejudices of such narrowly defined group.
So what it all comes down to is that we have an industry here, an important communications industry, a communications medium called motion picture, which is controlled and has been controlled for its, 115-year existence by pretty much the same people. A small group of politically liberal, not very religious Jewish males of European heritage. And that lack of diversity at the top results in a lack of diversity in the movies in terms of both people who are portrayed in the movies, positively and negatively, and it results in patterns of bias. It came about because of massive discrimination, so thousands of lives have been ruined over the years by those arbitrary choices that have been being made based on nepotism, cronyism, and favoritism and other forms of discrimination. And our democracy is being weakened as a result because of the narrow spectrum of ideas that are being disseminated through motion pictures by this narrowly defined group that controls Hollywood.
The Supreme Court observed that mass media may affect public attitudes and behavior in a variety of ways, ranging from direct espousal of a political or social doctrine to the subtle shaping of thought which characterizes all artistic expression. Given this, we the people and those shareholders who own the publicly held mainstream media corporations should work together to create more diversity in the executive ranks of the Hollywood-based studios and the New York-based networks.
The Supreme Court, I think, was expressing essentially self-evident truth, that the mass media is presenting ideas in all sorts of forms. They can be presenting political theories, political news, political fact. But the point is that motion pictures can go from fact to fiction. And across that wide spectrum, you can have all sorts of political influence. What political theories do you promote? Which ones do you denigrate? Which political facts do you choose to present in the nightly news or in the documentaries? Right? What kind of political opinions do you allow to be expressed with favor, or do you treat with disdain? What sort of fiction do you provide? The good guys have particular political viewpoints, the bad guys have the opposite. And in the long run, inundation of the public with particular viewpoints, whether presented as fact, opinion, or in some kind of fictional mode, are going to have long-term effects. He goes and he looks at the nightly news, and the news tells him, these are the facts about what's going on in Syria or Turkey or Bulgaria or whatever the country may be. Is he going to go himself and research those questions to determine whether that's true, or is he going to accept it, especially when he sees it day after day, night after night, week after week, because some of these things go on for a long period of time. And the same thing with fictional presentations. If the fictional presentations that he sees all take a particularly favorable attitude towards the Department of Homeland Security, towards the National Security Administration, surveilling everyone in the world, and so forth and so on, what is the impression that will be left in the mind of that viewer?
It should now be obvious that were it not for the internet, social media, and the Second Amendment, liberal, secular, anti-Christian, anti-American socialist forces in league with rogue apparatchiks in the D.C. swamp and the establishment political parties would by now have completely overrun the U.S. Republic.
So the more freedom we have, the more liberty we have, the more opportunity we have. You know, we complain about what we hear coming out of Hollywood. And many of the actors and actresses, you know, say things that to many of us are just abhorrent.
Blowing up the White House.
How many actors and actresses, how many people in that industry would be willing to speak out in alternative ways, with alternative ideas, if they weren't worried that by doing so would destroy their career? How many people are sitting there in silence and they're not saying anything? They don't agree with a lot of these things that are going on in Hollywood or the news media or education, whatever it may be. But for fear of character assassination, for fear of losing their job, for fear of being politically destroyed or economically destroyed, we need to give them a free platform that they can speak and that they can express themselves and get rid of this oligarchic dictatorship that literally is strangling the life out of our mainstream institutions and ultimately out of the life of our free republic.
It's clear that over 50 million Americans are now aware of the globalist agenda and its destruction of the U.S. manufacturing base, all promoted by the mainstream media.
I believe that globalization is inevitable, but people are scared of all this change. And what we have to do is to convince them that change can be their friend, and the way to do it is to say, okay, we're going to compete, and we're going to win over the long run.
Did Seattle surprise you?
No, I think I knew there'd be a lot of people there. I was surprised that there would be so many, basically, creeps there who would try to, you know...
Instigated, you mean?
Yeah, throw rocks through swords. There were just a very small percentage of those thousands of people who were doing this. Most of them were there to express their opposition to some aspect or another of this process of globalization.
Happy holidays.
Thank you.
President Clinton, back with more of Larry King Live after this.
It's now clear that rogue politicians, lobbyists, neocons, Zionists, central bankers, and multinational corporations have hijacked Congress to pass NAFTA, GATT, and TPP, all free trade agreements promoted by the mainstream media.
Today, as I sign the North American Free Trade Agreement into law, negotiators from 112 nations are seeking to conclude negotiations on a new round of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. A historic worldwide trade pact, one that would spur a global economic boom. I call on all the nations of the world to seize this moment and close the deal on a strong GATT agreement within the next week.
The Constitution is a document to restrain the government. And if you don't obey the Constitution, then you don't restrain government, you expand government. If you look at what's happened the last 100 years, I mean, whether it's foreign policy, attack on civil liberties, or economic policy, it's government intervention, constantly growing, and Republicans or Democrats. It's always more instead of less. And I think basically that it's because they don't follow their oath of office and obey the Constitution.
How would you like to lower the country's trade deficit and balance of payments by giving all Americans and all businesses tax deductions for buying American products and 90% profits going to American companies?
Would that work?
I wonder whether it would even be...
legal?
Yeah, it would certainly, I think, violate some of our international trade agreements, and it might cause others to retaliate against us.
But above and beyond the madness, the one story we should now promote, especially on the silver screen, is the story of liberty. In this scenario, Americans need not rely on imports. America can manufacture its own products. Americans can innovate and develop their own alternatives to oil and fossil fuels. Americans could even develop a free energy system and make all things Middle East a thing of the past. Most of all, Americans in partnership with free enterprise capitalism should limit the U.S. government to a size supported only by the taxes specified in the U.S. Constitution. This is the vision of the founders and their script for prosperity. And it's up to we the people to greenlight this script and shepherd the mainstream media back to nobler pastures, a place where the fruits of liberty can be enjoyed by all, a place where we can make America greater than anyone ever imagined. Now that would be a twist in the plot.